Chapter 23 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Humbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 23. The Lamourette Kiss. France still had its moments of enthusiasm and illusion before plunging into the abyss of woes. It seemed under an hallucination, or suffering from a sort of vertigo. A nameless frenzy, both in good and evil, agitated and disturbed it beyond measure in 1792, that year so fertile in surprises and dramas of every kind. Strange and bizarre epic, full of love and hatred, launching itself from one extreme to the other with frightful inconsistency, now weeping with tenderness, and now howling with rage. Society resembled a drunken man who is sometimes amiable in his cups, and sometimes cruel. There were sudden halts on the road of fury, oases in the midst of scorching sands, beneath a sun whose fire consumed. But the caravan does not rest long beneath the shady trees. Quickly it resumes its course as if urged by a mysterious force, and soon the terrible Simsum overwhelms and destroys it. Madame Elizabeth wrote to Madame de Régecourt, July 8, 1792. It would need all Madame de Sévigné's eloquence to describe properly what happened yesterday, for it was certainly the most surprising thing, the most extraordinary, the greatest, the smallest, etc., etc. But, fortunately, experience may aid comprehension. In a word, here were Jacobins, Feuillants, Republicans, and Monarchists, abjuring all their discords and assembling near the tree of the Constitution and of Liberty, to promise sincerely that they will act in accordance with law and not depart from it. Luckily, August is coming, the time when, the leaves being well grown, the tree of liberty will afford a more secure shelter. What had happened on the day before Madame Elizabeth wrote this letter? There had been a very singular session of the Legislative Assembly. In the morning, a woman named Olympe de Gouges, whose mother was a dealer in second-hand clothing at Montauban, being consumed with the desire to be talked about, had caused an emphatic placard to be posted up, in which she preached concord between all parties. This placard was like a prologue to the day's session. Among the deputies there was a certain Abbé Lamourette, the constitutional bishop of Léon, who played at religious democracy. He was an ex-Lazarist who had been professor of theology at the seminary at Tours. Weary of the conventional yoke, he had left his order, and at the beginning of the Revolution was the vicar general of the diocese of Arras. He had published several works in which he sought to reconcile philosophy and religion. Mirabeau was one of his acolytes, and adopted him as his theologian in ordinary, finding him fit to bishopize a Gevelier, to use his own expression. The great tribune recommended him to the electors of the Rhône department. It was thus that the Abbé Lamourette became the constitutional bishop of Léon. After his consecration, he issued a pastoral instruction in such agreement with the current ideas that Mirabeau, his protector, induced the Constituent Assembly to have it sent as a model to every department in France. In 1792, the Abbé Lamourette was 50 years old, affable, unctuous, his mouth always full of pacific and gentle words. He naively preached moderation, concord, and fraternity in conversations which were like so many sermons. For several days, the discussions in the assembly had been of unparalleled violence. Suspicion, hatred, rancor, wrath were unchained in a fury that bordered on delirium. Right and left emulated each other in outrages and invectives. Lafayette's appearance and the fear of a foreign invasion had disturbed all minds. The National Assembly, sitting both night and day, was like an arena of gladiators fighting without truce or pity. It was this moment which the good Abbé Lamourette chose for delivering his most touching sermon from the tribune. During the session of July 7th, Brissot was about to ascend the tribune and propose new measures of public safety. Lamourette, getting before him, asked to be heard on a motion of order. He said that of all the means proposed for arresting the divisions which were destroying France, but one had been forgotten, and that the only one which could be efficacious. It was the union of all Frenchmen in one mind, the reconciliation of all the deputies without exception. What was to prevent this? The only irreconcilable things are crime and virtue. What do all our mistrust and suspicions amount to? One party in the Assembly attributes to the other a seditious desire to destroy the monarchy. The others attribute to their colleagues a desire to destroy constitutional equality and to establish the aristocratic government known as that of the two chambers. These are the disastrous suspicions which will divide the empire. Very well, cried the Abbé, let us crush both the Republic and the two chambers. The hall rang with unanimous applause from the assembly and the galleries. From all sides came shouts of, "Yes, yes, we want nothing but the Constitution." Lamourette went on. Let us swear to have but one mind, one sentiment. Let us swear to sink all our differences and become a homogeneous mass of freemen, formidable both to the spirit of anarchy and that of feudalism. The moment when foreigners see that we all desire one settled thing and that we all desire it will be the moment when liberty will triumph and France will be saved. I ask the President to put to vote this simple proposition: that those who equally abjure and execrate the Republic and the two chambers shall rise. At once, as if moved by the same impulse, the members of the Assembly rose as one man, and swore enthusiastically never to permit, either by the introduction of the Republican system or by that of the two chambers, any alteration whatsoever in the Constitution. By a spontaneous movement, the members of the extreme left went towards the deputies of the right. They were received with open arms, and, in their turn, the right advanced towards the ranks of the left. All parties blended. Jaucourt and Merlin, Albite and Marmont, Gensonnet and Calvet, Chabot and Gentil. Men who ordinarily opposed each other relentlessly could be seen sitting on the same bench. As if by miracle, the Assembly chamber became the temple of concord. The moved spectators mingled their acclamations with the oaths of the deputies. According to the expressions of the Moniteur, serenity and joy were on all faces, and unction in every heart. M. Emery was the next speaker. "When the Assembly is reunited," said he, "all the powers ought to be so. I ask, therefore, that the Assembly at once send the King the minutes of its proceedings by a deputation of 24 members." The motion was adopted. A few minutes later, Louis XIV, followed by the deputation and surrounded by his ministers, entered the hall. Cries of "Long live the nation! Long live the King!" resounded from every side. The sovereign placed himself near the president, and in a voice that betrayed emotion, made the following address: "Gentlemen, the spectacle most affecting to my heart is that of the reunion of all wills for the sake of the country's safety. I have long desired this salutary moment. My desire is accomplished. The nation and the King are one. Each of them has the same end in view. Their reunion will save France. The Constitution should be the rallying point for all Frenchmen. We all ought to defend it. The King will always set the example of so doing." The President replied, "Sire, this is a memorable moment. When all constituted authorities unite, is a signal of joy to the friends of liberty, and of terror to its enemies. From this union will issue the force necessary to combat the tyrants combined against us. It is a sure warrant of liberty." After prolonged applause, a great silence followed. I own to you, M. the President, presently said the complaisant Louis XIV, that I was longing for the deputation to finish, so that I might hasten to the assembly. Applause and cries of "Long live the nation! Long live the king!" redoubled. What? This monarch now acclaimed is the same prince against whom Verignan hurled invectives a few days ago, with the enthusiastic approbation of the same assembly? He is the sovereign with whom the Girondins thus addressed, "O king, who doubtless have believed with Lysander the tyrant that truth is no better than a lie, and that men must be amused with oaths like children with rattles, who have pretended to love the laws only to preserve the power that will enable you to defy them, the Constitution only that it may not cast you from the throne where you must remain in order to destroy it, the nation only to assure the success of your perfidy by inspiring it with confidence. Do you think you can impose upon us today by hypocritical protestations? What has occurred since the day when Verignan, uttering such words as these, was frantically cheered? Nothing. That day the weathercock pointed to anger, today to concord. Why? No one knows. Tired of hating, the assembly doubtless needed an instant of relaxation. Violent sentiments end by wearying the souls that experience them. They must rest and renew their energies in order to hate better tomorrow. And why say tomorrow? This very evening the quarreling, anger, and fury will begin anew. At 3:30, Louis XIV left the hall of the Manège in the midst of joyful applause from the Assembly and the galleries. During the evening session, discord reappeared. The following letter from the king was read. I have just been handed the departmental decree which provisionally suspends the mayor and the procureur of the Commune of Paris. As this decree is based on facts which personally concern me, the first impulse of my heart is to beg the Assembly to decide upon it. Does anyone believe that the Assembly will have the courage to condemn Pétion on the 20th of June? Not a bit of it. It makes no decision, but passes unanimously from the King's letter to the order of the day. And what occurs at the clubs? Listen to Billaud-Varennes at the Jacobins. They embrace each other at the Assembly, he exclaims, but it is the kiss of Judas. It is the kiss of Charles IX, extending his hand to the Coligny. They were embracing like this while the king was preparing for flight on October 6th. They were embracing like this before the massacres of Champ de Mars. They embrace, but are the court conspiracies coming to an end? Have our enemies ceased their advance against our frontiers? Is Lafayette the less a traitor? And thereupon the cry broke out, "Pétion or death!" The next day, June 8th, at the Assembly, loud applause greeted the orator from a section who said, concerning the department, "It openly serves the sinister projects and disastrous conspiracies of a perfidious court. It is the first link in the immense chain of plots formed against the people. It is an accomplice in the extravagant projects of this general, who, not being able to become the hero of liberty, has preferred to make himself the Don Quixote of the court." A deputy exclaimed, "The acclamations with which the Assembly has listened to this petition authorize me to ask its publication. I make an express motion to that effect." And the publication was decreed. Oh, poor Lamourette, humanitarian abbé, rose-water revolutionist, of what avail is your democratic holy water? What have you gained by your sentimental jargon? What do your dreams of evangelical philosophy and universal brotherhood amount to? Poor constitutional abbé, people are already scoffing at your sacerdotal unction, your soothing homily. The very men who, to please you, have sworn to destroy the Republic will proclaim it 2.5 months later. Your famous reunion of parties? People are already shrugging their shoulders at it, calling it the Baiser d'Amourette, la réconciliation normande, the calf-love kiss, the pretended reconciliation. They accuse you of having sold yourself to the court. They ridicule, they flout, and they will kill you. January 11th, 1794, Fouquier-Tinville's prosecuting speech will punish you for your moderatism. You will carry your head to the scaffold, and, optimist to the end, you will say, "What is the guillotine?" Only a rap on the neck. End of chapter 23. Recording by Joy Suzanne Grazier. On the web at burningjoy.com.
Chapter 24 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imberto Santamo. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 24. The Fete of the Federation in 1792. The Fete of the Federation, which was to be celebrated July 14, was awaited with anxiety. The Federates came into Paris full of the most revolutionary projects. Anxiety and anguish reigned at the Tuileries. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who were to be present at the Champ de Mars, feared to be assassinated there. The Queen's importunities decided the King to have a plastron made to ward off poniard thrust. Composed of 15 thickness of Italian taffeta, this plastron consisted of a vest and a large belt. Madame Campan secretly tried it on the King in the chamber when Marie Antoinette was lying. Pulling Madame Campan by the dress as far as possible from the Queen's bed, Louis XVI whispered, "It is to satisfy her that I yield. They will not assassinate me. Their plan is changed. They will put me to death in another way." When the King had gone out, the Queen forced Madame Campan to tell her what he had just said. "I had divined it," she exclaimed. "He said this long time, that all that is going on in France is an imitation of the revolution in England under Charles I. I began to dread an impeachment for him. As for me, I am a foreigner, and they will assassinate me. What will become of my poor children?" And she fell to weeping. Madame Campan tried to administer a nervine, but the Queen refused it. "The nervous maladies," said she, "are the ailments of happy women. I no longer have them." Without her knowledge, a sort of corset, in the style of her husband's plastron, had been made for her. Nothing could induce her to wear it. "If seditious persons assassinate me, so much the better. They will deliver me from the most sorrowful life." The Fete of the Federation was celebrated in 1792 amidst extremely tragical preoccupations. Things had changed very greatly since the Fete, which had excited such enthusiasm 2 years earlier. On July 14, 1790, the Champ de Mars was filled at 4 o'clock in the morning by a crowd delirious with joy. At 8 o'clock in the morning of July 14, 1792, it was still empty. The people were said to be at Bastille witnessing the laying of the first stone of the column to be erected on the ruins of the famous fortress. On the Champ de Mars, there were no magnificent altar served by the 300 priests, no side benches covered by an innumerable crowd, none of the sincere and ardent joy which throbbed in every heart 2 years before. For the Fete of 1792, 83 little tents, representing the departments of the kingdom, had been erected on the hillocks of sand. Before each tent stood a poplar so frail that it seemed as if a breath might blow away the tree and its tricolored pendant. In the middle of Champ de Mars were 4 stretchers covered with canvas, painted grey which would have made a miserable decoration for a boulevard theatre. It was a so-called tomb, an honorary monument to those who had died or were about to die on the frontiers. On one side of it was the inscription, "Tremble, tyrants, we will avenge them." The altar of the country could hardly be seen. It was formed of truncated column placed on top of the altar steps raised in 1790. Perfumes were burned on the four small corner altars. 200 yards further off, near the sign, a large tree had been set up and named the Tree of Feudalism. From its branches depended escutcheons, helmets, and blue ribbons interwoven with chains. This tree rose out of a wood pile on which lay a heap of crowns, tiaras, cardinals' hats, St. Peter's keys, ermine mantles, doctors' caps, and titles of nobility. A royal crown was among them, and beside it the escutcheons of the Count de Provence, the Count d'Artois, and the Prince de Condé. The organizers of the fête hoped to induce the king himself to set fire to this pile covered with feudal emblems. A figure representing liberty and another representing law were placed on the casters, by the aid of which the two divinities were to be rolled about. 54 pieces of cannon bordered the Champ de Mars on the side next to the sign, and the Parisian cab crowned every tree. At 11 in the morning, the king and his cortege arrived at the military school. A detachment of cavalry opened the march. There were 3 carriages. In the first were the Prince de Poix, the Marquis de Brise, and the Count de Saint-Priest. In the second, the Queen's ladies, Mesdames de Taran, de la Roche-Aymon, de Maillet, and de Macau. In the third, the King, the Queen, their 2 children, and Madame Elizabeth. The trumpets sounded and the drums beat a salute. A salvo of artillery announced the arrival of the royal family. The sovereign's countenance was mild and benevolent. Marie Antoinette appeared still more majestic than usual. The dignity of her demeanor, the grace of her children, and the angelic charm of Madame Elizabeth inspired a tender respect. The little Dauphin wore the uniform of a National Guard. "He has not deserved the cap yet," said the Queen to the grenadiers. The royal family took their place on the balcony of the military school, which was covered with red velvet carpet embroidered with gold, and watched the popular procession entering the Champ de Mars by the gate of the Rue de Grenelle and marching towards the altar of the country. What a strange procession! Men, women, children, armed with pikes, sticks, and hatchets, bands singing the Saira, drunken harlots adorned with flowers, people from the faubourgs with the inscription, "Long live Pétion," chalked on their headgear, 6 legions of the National Guards marching pell-mell with their sans-culottes, red caps, placards with devices either ferocious or stupid, like this one, "Long live the heroes who died in the siege of the Bastille," a plan in relief of the celebrated fortress. A travelling printing press throwing off copies of the Revolutionary Manifesto, which the crowd at first mistook for a little guillotine. A great deal of noise and shouting, and there you have the popular cortege. By way of compensation, the troops of the line and the grenadiers of the National Guard displayed extreme royalist sentiments. The 104th Regiment of the Infantry, having halted under the balcony, its band played on air, "Où pourtant être mieux qu'un sien de sa famille?" Where is one better off than in the bosom of his family? The moment when Louis XVI left the military school to walk on the altar of the country with the National Assembly was not without solemnity. A certain anxiety was felt by all as to what might happen. Would Louis XVI be struck by a ball or by a poniard? What might not be feared from so many demoniacs howling like cannibals? The king, the deputies, the soldiers, the crowd, all pressed against each other in a solid mass that left no vacant spaces. All was in continual undulation. Louis XVI could only advance slowly and with difficulty. The intervention of the troops was necessary to enable him to reach the altar of the country, where he was to swear the allegiance for the second time to the Constitution, whose fragments were to overwhelm his throne. It needed the character of Louis XVI, Madame de Staël has said. It needed that martyred character which he never belied to support such a situation as he did. His gait, his countenance, had something peculiar to himself. On other occasions, one might have wished he had more grandeur, but at this moment it was enough for him to remain what he was in order to appear sublime. From a distance, I watched his powdered head in the midst of all those black ones. His coat, still embroidered as it had been in former days, stood out against the costumes of the common people who pressed around him. When he ascended the steps of the altar, one seemed to behold the sacred victim offering himself in voluntary sacrifice. The queen had remained on the balcony of the military school, from where she watched through a lorgnette the dangerous progress of the king. A prey to the inexpressible emotion, she remained motionless during an entire hour, hardly able to breathe on account of excessive anguish. She used the lorgnette steadily, but at one moment she cried out, "He has come down 2 steps." This cry made all those about her shudder. The king could not, in fact, reach the summit of the altar because a throng of suspicious-looking persons had already taken possession of it. Deputy Dumas had the presence of mind to cry out, "Attention, grenadiers! Present arms!" The intimidated sans-culottes remained quiet, and Louis XVI took the oath amid the thundering of cannons rang beside the Seine. It was then proposed to the king that he should set fire to the tree of feudalism. It was close to the river, and the arms of France were hung upon it. Louis XVI spared himself that shame, exclaiming, "There is no more feudalism." He returned to the military school by the way he came. The 6th Legion of the National Guard had not yet marched past when the cavalry announced the king's approach. This legion, quickening its pace, was intercepted by the royal escort and invaded, not to say routed, by the populace, which from all sides pressed into its ranks. Meanwhile, the anguish of Marie Antoinette redoubled. The expression of the queen's face, Madame de Staël says again, will never be effaced from my memory. Her eyes were drowned in tears. The splendor of her toilette, the dignity of her demeanor, contrasted with the throng that surrounded her. Nothing separated her from the populace but a few National Guards. The armed men assembled in the Champ de Mars seemed more as if they had come together for a riot than for a festival. Feuillants, who had been reinstated in his functions as mayor of Paris on the previous day, was the hero of the occasion. They called him King Feuillants, and the cheers which resounded in the honor of this revolutionist were like a funeral knell in the ears of Marie Antoinette. At last, Louis XVI appeared in front of the military school. The queen experienced a momentary joy in seeing him approach. Rising hastily, she ran down the stairs to meet him. Always calm, the king tenderly clasped his wife's hand. At once, royalist sentiment took fire. All who were present, National Guards, troops of the Lion, Switzers, people in the courts, at the windows, on the balconies and gates, all cried, "Long live the king! Long live the queen!" The royal family regained the Tuileries in the midst of acclamations. At the entrance of the palace, enthusiasm deepened. From the royal court to the great stairway of the Horloge Pavilion, the grenadiers of the National Guard, who had escorted and saved the king, formed into a line with shouts of joy. "All former souvenirs," says the Count de Vaublanc, in his memoirs, all former habits of respect and awoke. Yes, I saw and observed this multitude. It was animated with the best sentiments. At heart, it was faithful to its king and crowned him with sincere benedictions. But do popular love and fidelity afford any support to a tottering throne? He is mad who can think so. The people will be spectators of the latest combat and will applaud the victor, and let no one blame them. What can they do if they are not united, encouraged, and led? The people behold a few seditious individuals attack a throne, and a few courageous men defend it. They fear one party and desire the success of the other. When the struggle is over, they submit and obey. The most honest of them weep in silence. The timid force themselves to display a guilty joy in order to escape the hatred of the victors, whom they see bathing themselves in blood. They think about their families, their affairs, their means of support. They are not expected to lead themselves. That duty was imposed on others. Have they fulfilled it? It is said that during the fete, those who were friendly to the king amongst the crowd were awaiting a signal they expected from him. They hoped that by the assistance of the Swiss, they would force their way to the royal family during the confusion of a hand-to-hand affray and get them safely out of Paris. But Louis XVI neither spoke nor acted. He returned to his palace without having dared anything, and nevertheless, there were still many chances of safety open. Imagine the effect of a haughty bearing, a commanding gesture, the place of the inert attitude habitual to the unfortunate sovereign. Fancy the most Christian king, the heir of Louis XIV, on the horseback, haranguing the people in the style of his witty and valiant ancestor. Henry IV, he is still king. The troops of the line are faithful. The great majority of the National Guard are well disposed towards him. Luckner, Lafayette, Dumouriez himself would ask nothing better than to defend him if he would have to show a little energy. The day after the ceremony of July 14, Lafayette was still anxious that Louis XVI should leave Paris openly and go to Compiègne, so as to show France and Europe that he was free. In case of resistance, the general demanded only 50 loyal cavaliers to take the royal family away. From Compiègne, picked squadrons would conduct them to the midst of the French army, the asylum of devotion and honor. But Louis XVI refused, the last resources remaining to him were to evaporate between his hands. He will profit neither by the sympathies of all the European courts, which ardently desire his safety, by his civil list, which might be such an efficacious mean of action, nor by the loyalty of his brave soldiers, who are ready to shed their last drop of blood in his defense. A large party in the Legislative Assembly would ask nothing but a signal, providing it was seriously given, to rally with vigor to the royal cause. He had intrepid champions, there whom no menace could affright, and who on every occasion, no matter how violent or tumultuous the galleries might be, had braved the storm with heroic constancy. Public opinion was changing for the better. The schemes and languages of the Jacobins exasperated the mass honest people. The provinces were sending addresses of fidelity to the king. What was lacking to the monarch to enable him to combine so many scattered elements into a single group? A little will, a little of what essential quality, audacity, which according to Danton is the last word of politics. But Louis XVI was a timorous soul. If he makes one step forward, he is in haste to make another back. He is scrupulous, hesitating. He has no confidence in himself or anyone else. This prince, so incontestably courageous, acts as if he were a coward. He has made so many concessions already that the idea of any manner of resistance seems to him chimerical. Does the fate of Charles I make him dread this beginning of a civil war as the supreme danger? Does he fear to imperil the lives of his wife and children by an energetic deed? Is he expecting foreign aid? Does he think to prove his wisdom by his patience and that success will crown delay? Is he so benevolent, so gentle, that the least thought of repression is repugnant to him? Does he wish to carry to extremes the pardon of injuries which is recommended by the gospel? What is plain is that he rejects every firm resolution. Palliatives, expedients, half measures were what suited this honest but feeble nature. Disturbed by contradictory counsels and no longer knowing what to desire or what to hope, he looked on at his own destruction like an unmoved spectator. He was no longer a sovereign full of sentiment of his power and his rights, but an almost unconscious victim of fatality. Example full of startling lessons for all leaders of state who adopt weakness as a system and who, under pretext of benevolence or moderation, no longer know how to foresee, to will, or to strike. End of chapter 24. Recording by Lambda.
Chapter 25 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Craster. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 25. The Last Days at the Tuileries. During one of the last nights of July, at 1 o'clock, Madame Campan was alone near the Queen's bed, when she heard someone walking softly in the adjoining corridor, which was ordinarily locked at both ends. Madame Campan summoned the valet de chambre, who went into the corridor. Presently, the noise of two men fighting reached the ears of Marie Antoinette. "What a position!" cried the unfortunate Queen. "Insults by day and assassins by night." The valet cried, "Madame, it is a scoundrel whom I know. I am holding him." "Let him go," said the Queen. "Open the door for him. He came to assassinate me. He will be carried in triumph by the Jacobins tomorrow." People were constantly saying that the Faubourg Saint-Antoine was getting ready to march against the palace. Marie Antoinette was so badly guarded, and it was so easy to force an entrance to her apartment on the ground floor opposite the garden, that Madame de Tourzel, her children's governess, begged her to sleep in the Dauphin's room on the first floor. The Queen was averse to this step, as she was unwilling to have anyone suspect her uneasiness. But Madame de Tourzel, having shown her that it would be easy to keep the secret of this change by using the Dauphin's private staircase, she ended by accepting the proposal so long as the trouble should last. She was so thoughtful of all those in her service that it cost her much to incommode them in the least. Finally, she consented to use the bed of the governess, and a pallet was laid for the latter every evening. Mademoiselle Pauline de Tourzel slept on a sofa in an adjoining closet. As no one in the house suspected that the Queen might have changed her apartment for the night, Madame de Tourzel and her daughter took precautionary measures. When the Queen had gone to bed, they arose, and after making sure that the doors were locked, they shot the inside bolts. "The closet I occupied served as a passage for the royal family when they went to supper," said Mademoiselle de Tourzel, afterwards Madame de Béarn, in her Souvenir de 40 Ans. "I went to bed early. Sometimes I pretended to be asleep when the princess was passing through, and I saw them approach my sofa one after another. I heard their expressions of kindness and goodwill toward me, and noticed what care they took not to disturb my slumber." Poor Marie Antoinette! Could anyone believe that a Queen of France would be reduced to keeping a little dog in her bedroom to warn her of the least noise in her apartment? The Dauphin, delighted to have his mother sleep so near him, used to run to her as soon as he awoke, and clasping her in his little arms would say the most affectionate things. This was the only moment of the day that brought her any consolation. By the end of July, both the Queen and her children were obliged to give up walking in the garden. She had gone out to take the air with her daughter in the Dauphin's small parterre, at the extreme end of the Tuileries, close to the Place Louis XV. Some federates grossly insulted her. 4 Swiss officers made their way through the crowd, and placing the Queen and the young princess between them, brought them back to the palace. When they reached her apartments, Marie Antoinette thanked her defenders in the most affecting terms, but she never went out again. After June 20, the garden, excepting the terrace of the Feuillants, which by a decree of the Assembly had become a part of its precincts, had been forbidden to the populace. Posters warned the people to remain on the terrace and not go down into the garden. The terrace was called National Ground, and the garden Land of Koblenz. Inscriptions apprised passer-bys of this novel topography. Tricolored ribbons had been tied to the banisters of the staircases by way of barriers. Placards were fastened at intervals to the trees bordering the terrace, whereon could be read, "Citizens, respect yourselves. Give the force of bayonets to this feeble barrier. Citizens, do not go into this foreign land, this Koblenz, abode of corruption." The leaders had such an empire over the crowd that no one disobeyed. And yet it was the height of summer. The trees offered their verdant shade, and the king had withdrawn all his guards and opened every gate. Nobody dared infringe the revolutionary mandate. One young man, paying no attention, went down into the garden. Furious clamors broke out on all sides. "To the lamp-post with him!" cried someone on the terrace. Thereupon the young man, taking off his shoes, drew out his handkerchief and began to wipe the dust from their soles. People cried bravo, and he was carried in triumph. Marie Antoinette could not become resigned to this hatred. Often she frightened her women by wishing to go out of the palace and address the people. "Yes," she would cry, her voice trembling, as she walked quickly to and fro in her chamber. "Yes, I will say to them, Frenchmen, they have had the cruelty to persuade you that I do not love France. I, the wife of its king and the mother of a dauphin." Then, this brief moment of generous exaltation over, the illusion of being able to move a nation of insulters quickly vanished. Her life was a daily, hourly struggle. The wife, the mother, the queen, never ceased to contend against destiny. She hardly slept or ate, but from the very excess of danger she drew additional energy and moral and material force. As she awoke at daybreak, she required that the shutters should not be closed, so that her sleepless nights might be sooner consoled by the light of morning. The most widely diverse sentiments occupied her soul. A captive in her palace, she sometimes believed herself irrevocably condemned by fate, and sometimes hoped for deliverance. Toward the middle of one of the last nights preceding the 10th of August, the moon shone into her bedchamber. "In a month," she said to Madame Campan, "I shall not see that moon unless I am freed from my chains." But she was not free from anxiety concerning all that might happen before that. "The king is not a poltroon," she added. "He has very great passive courage, but he is crushed by a false shame, a doubt of himself which arises from his education quite as much as from his character. He is afraid of commanding. He dreads above everything to speak to assemblages of men. He lives uneasily and like a child under the eyes of Louis XV until he was 20, and this constraint has had an effect on his timidity. In our circumstances, a few clearly spoken words addressed to the Parisians who are devoted to us would immensely strengthen our party, but he will not say them." Then Marie Antoinette explained why she did not put herself forward more. "For my part," said she, "I could act and mount a horse if need were. But if I acted, it would put weapons into the hands of king's enemies. A general outcry would be raised in France against the Austrian woman, against female domination. Moreover, I should reduce the king to nothingness by showing myself. A queen who is not regent must in such circumstances remain inactive and prepare to die." The danger constantly increased. At 4 in the morning of one of the last days of July, warning was given at the palace that the faubourgs were threatening, and would doubtless march against the Tuileries. Madame Campan went very softly into the queen's room. For a wonder, Marie Antoinette was sleeping peacefully and profoundly. Madame Campan did not rouse her. "You were right," said Louis XVI. "It is good to see her take a little rest. Oh, her griefs redouble mine." At her waking, the queen, on being informed of what had passed, began to weep and said, "Why was I not called?" Madame Campan excused herself by saying, "It was only a false alarm. Your Majesty needed to repair your prostrate strength." "It is not prostrate," quickly replied the courageous sovereign. "Misfortune makes it all the greater. Elizabeth was with the king, and I was sleeping, I who wished to perish beside him. I am his wife. I am not willing that he should incur the least danger without me." On Saturday, August 5th, the last Sunday the royal family were to spend at the Tuileries, As they were going to the chapel to hear Mass, half the National Guards on duty cried, "Long live the King!" The others said, "No, no, no King, down with the veto!" The same day at Vespers, the chanters had agreed to swell their tones greatly, and in a menacing way, when reciting this versicle of the Magnificat, "De poursuit pourtant de sed." He had put down the mighty from their seat. In their turn, the Royalists, after the Dominum salvum fac regem, cried thrice, turning as they did so toward the Queen, "Et Reginam." There was a continual murmuring all through the divine office. 5 days later, the same chapel was to be a pool of blood. And yet Madame Elisabeth, always calm and always angelic, still had illusions. One morning of this terrible month of August, while in her room in the pavilion of Flora, she thought she heard someone humming her favorite air, Pauvre Jacques, beneath her windows. Attracted by this refrain, which in the midst of sorrow renewed the souvenir of happier times, she half opened her window and listened attentively. The words sung were not those of the ballad she loved, yet they were royalist in sentiment and adapted to the same air. The poor people had been substituted for poor Jacques, the poor people who were pitied for having a king no longer, and for knowing nothing but wretchedness. Such marks of attachment consoled the virtuous princess, and made her hope against all hope. She wrote, August 8th, to a friend, Madame de Raigecourt, "They say that the king is going to be turned out of here somewhat forcibly, and made to lodge in the Hôtel de Ville. They say that there will be a very strong movement to that effect in Paris. Do you believe it? For my part, I do not. I believe in rumors, but not in their resulting in anything. That is my profession of faith. For the rest, everything is perfectly quiet today. Yesterday passed in the same way, and I think this one will be like it." On August 9th, the eve of the fatal day, Madame Elisabeth again addressed a reassuring letter to one of her friends, Madame de Bombelle. Curiously enough, she dated this letter August 10th, no doubt by accident, and when Madame de Bombelle received it, she read these lines, which seemed like the irony of fate. "This day of the 10th, which was to have been so exciting, so terrible, is as calm as possible. The Assembly has decreed neither deposition nor suspension." End of chapter 25, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 26 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 26. The Prologue to the 10th of August. The first rumblings of the storm began. People quarrelled and fought in the Palais Royal, the cafes and the theatres. Half of the National Guard sided with the court, and the other half with the people. To seditious speeches were added songs full of insults to the king and queen. These songs, sold on every corner, applauded in every tavern, and repeated by the wives and children of the people, propagated revolutionary fury. There was a constant succession of gatherings, brawls, and riots. The Assembly had declared the country in danger. Rumours of every sort excited popular imagination. It was said that priests who refused the oath were in hiding at the Tuileries, which was, moreover, full of arms and munitions. The Duke of Brunswick's manifesto exasperated national sentiment. It was read aloud in every street. The leaders neglected nothing likely to excite the populace, and prepared their last attack on the throne, their after-peace of June 20th, with as much audacity as skill. In order to subdue the court, it was necessary to destroy its only remaining means of defence. To leave plenty of elbow room for the riot, the Assembly on June 15th ordered the troops of the line to be sent some 35 miles beyond Paris and kept there. A singular means was devised for breaking up the choice troops of the National Guard, who were royalists. They were told that it was contrary to equality for certain citizens to be more brilliantly equipped than others, that a bearskin cap humiliated those who were entitled only to a felt one, and that there was a something aristocratic about the name of grenadier, which was really intolerable to a simple foot soldier. The choice troops were dissolved in consequence, and the grenadiers came to the Assembly like good patriots to lay down their epaulets and bearskin caps and assume the red cap. On July 30th, the National Guard was reconstructed, by taking in all the vagabonds and bandits that the clubs could muster. The famous Federates of Marseille, who were to take such an active part in the coming insurrection, arrived in Paris the same day. The Girondins, having failed to obtain their camp of 20,000 men before Paris, had devised instead of it a reunion of Federate volunteers summoned from every part of France. The roads were at once thronged by future rioters, whom the Assembly allowed 30 cents a day. The Jacobins of Brest and Marseille distinguished themselves. Instead of a handful of volunteers, they sent 2 battalions. That of Marseille, recruited by Barbaroux, comprised 500 men and 2 pieces of artillery. Starting July 5th, it entered Paris July 30th. Excited to fanaticism by the sun and the declamations of the southern clubs, it had run over France, been received under triumphal arches, and chanted in a sort of frenzy the terrible stanzas of Rouget de Lille's new hymn, the Marseillaise. It was at this time that Blanc Gilly, deputy from the Bouches-du-Rhône department to the Legislative Assembly, wrote, "These pretended Marseillais are the scum of the jails of Genoa, Piedmont, Sicily, and all of Italy, Spain, the archipelago, and Barbary. I run across them every day." Rouget de Lille received from his old mother, a royalist and Catholic at heart, a letter in which she said, "What is this revolutionary hymn which a horde of brigands are singing as they pass through France, and in which your name is mixed up?" At Paris, the accents of that terrible melody sounded like strokes of the tocsin. The men who sang it filled the conservatives with terror. They wore woolen cockades and insulted as aristocrats those who wore silk ones. There was no longer any dike to the torrent. August 1st, Louis XVI nominated a cabinet composed of loyal men. Joly was Minister of Justice, Champion de Villeneuve of the Interior, Bigot de Sainte-Croix of Foreign Affairs, Dubouchage of the Marine, Leroux de la Vie of Public Taxes, and Davancourt of War. But this ministry was to last only 10 days. Certain petitioners at the bar of the Assembly asked for the deposition of the king in the most violent language. This measure, says Barbaroux in his memoirs, would have carried Philippe of Orleans to the regency, and therefore his party violently clamoured for it. His creditors, his hirelings and boon companions, Marat and his Cordeliers, all manner of swindlers and insolvent debtors, thronged public places and incited to this deposition because they were hungry for money and positions under a regent who was their tool and their accomplice. In vain did Louis XVI display those sentiments of paternal kindness which had hitherto availed him so little. August 3rd, he sent a message to the Assembly in which he said, "I will uphold national independence to my last breath. Personal dangers are nothing compared to public ones. Oh, what are personal dangers to a king whom men are seeking to deprive of his people's love? This is the real plague spot in my heart. Perhaps the people will some day know how dear their welfare is to me. How many of my sorrows could be obliterated by the least evidence of a return to right feeling." How did they respond to this conciliatory language? After it had been read, Pétion, the mayor of Paris, presented himself at the bar and read an address from the Council General of the Commune in which these words occur: "The chief of the executive power is the first link of the counter-revolutionary chain. Through a lingering forbearance, we would have desired the power to ask you for the suspension of Louis XVI, but to this the Constitution is opposed. Louis XVI incessantly invokes the Constitution. We invoke it in our turn and ask you for his deposition." The next day, the municipality distributed 5,000 ball cartridges to the Marseillais while refusing any to the National Guards. Nevertheless, the Girondins still hesitated. Roidet, Vergniaud, and Chansonnet would have declared themselves satisfied if the 3 ministers belonging to their party had been reinstated, and on July the 29th they secretly dispatched a letter to the sovereign by Thierry, his valet de chambre, in which they said that, attached to the interests of the nation, they would never separate them from those of the king except in so far as he separated them himself. As to Barbaroux, like a true visionary, he dreamed of I know not what Rosewater insurrection. They should not have entered the apartments of the palace, he has said, but merely blockaded them. Had this plan been followed, the blood of Frenchmen and Swiss, ignorant victims of court perfidy, would not have been shed on the 10th of August. The Republic would have been founded without convulsions or massacres, and we, corroded by popular gangrene, should not have become the horror of all nations. The demagogues were not at all certain of success. Robespierre was to spend the 10th of August in the discreet darkness of a cellar. Danton was prudently to await the end of the combat before arming himself with a big sabre and marching at the head of the Marseille battalion as the hero of the day. Barbaroux says in his memoirs that on the 1st, 3rd and 7th of August, Marat implored him to take him to Marseille, and that on the evening of the 9th he renewed this prayer more urgently than ever, adding that he would disguise himself as a jockey in order to get away. In spite of their many weaknesses, the majority of the Assembly were Royalists and Constitutionalists all. The proof is that on August 8th, in spite of the violent menaces of the galleries, they decided by 406 against 244 votes that there was no occasion to impeach Lafayette, so abhorred by the Jacobins. This vote excited the wrath of the revolutionists to fury. The conservative deputies were insulted, pursued and struck. Several of them barely escaped assassination. The sessions became stormier from day to day. Not only were the large galleries of the Assembly overthrown by violent crowds, but the courtyards, the approaches and the corridors were obstructed. Many sat or stood on the exterior entablatures of the high windows. The upper part of the hall where the Jacobins sat received many strangers, in spite of the often reiterated opposition of the right. Below this mountain sat the members of the centre, the Ventrue. There were not seats enough for them, and they were crowded up in a ridiculous manner. At the bottom of the hall, almost entirely deserted, were the 44 members of the right. They were easily marked and counted by their future executioners, who threatened them by voice and gesture. Every day, the petitioners who were admitted to the honours of the session avoided the empty benches of the right and seated themselves with the mountain or the centre, where they crowded still more the already overcrowded deputies. The discussions were like formidable tempests. The effect produced by such a spectacle, says Count de Vaublanc in his memoirs, was still greater on those who entered the hall during one of those terrible moments. I received this impression several times myself, and it will never be effaced from my mind. I seek vainly for expression by which to describe it. Long afterwards, M. de Caux, then Minister of War, said to me, "You made the profoundest impression on me which I ever received in my life. I was young at the time. I entered the galleries just as you were standing out against the furious shouts of a part of the deputies and the people in the galleries." Meanwhile, the end was approaching. Faithful royalists still proposed schemes of flight to Louis XVI. Bertrand de Molleville, who is so ill-disposed towards Madame de Staël, was concerning this. There was nobody, even to Madame de Staël, who either in the hope of being pardoned the injury her intrigues had done the king, or else through her continual need of intrigue, had not invented some plan of escape for his Majesty. Louis XVI declined them all. He would owe nothing to Lafayette. He relied on the money he had given to Danton and other demagogues, and hoped that the insurrectionary bands would be repulsed by the royalists of the National Guard and the Swiss regiment. August 8th in the evening, this fine regiment left its Courbevoie barracks and arrived at the Tuileries at daybreak next morning. Under various idle pretexts, it had been deprived of its 12 pieces of artillery and also of 300 men who had been given the commission, true or false as may be, to watch over the transportation of corn in Normandy. Only 750 officers and soldiers remained, but all of them had said, "We will let ourselves be killed to the last man rather than fail in honor or betray the sanctity of our oaths." In company with a handful of noblemen, these were to be the last defenders of the throne. The fatal hour was approaching. The section of the Cordeliers had decided that if the Assembly had not pronounced the king's deposition by the evening of August 9th, the drums should beat the general alarm at the stroke of midnight, and the insurrection march against the Tuileries. The revolutionists were to carry out their plan, and the Swiss to keep their word. End of chapter 26. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 27 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Humbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 27. The night of August 9th to 10th. The night was serene, the sky clear and sown with stars. The calmness of nature contrasted with the revolutionary passions that had been unchained. On account of the heat, all the windows of the Tuileries had been left open, and from a distance the palace could be seen illuminated as if for a fête. It had just struck midnight. The revolution was executing the program of the Cordeliers section. The tocsin was sounding all over the city. Everybody named the church whose bell he thought he recognized. The people of the faubourgs were out of bed in their houses. The drums mingled with the tocsin. The revolutionists beat the general alarm, and the royalists the call to arms. No one was asleep at the Tuileries. There was no further question of etiquette. The night reception in the royal bedchamber was omitted for the first time. Certain old servitors, faithful guardians of tradition, in vain recalled that it was not permissible to sit down in the sovereign's apartments. The courtiers of the last hour seated themselves in armchairs, on tables and consoles. Louis XVI stayed sometimes in his chamber, and sometimes in his great cabinet, also called the Council Hall, where the assembled ministers received constant tidings of what was happening without. The pious monarch had summoned his confessor, Abbé Hébert, and shutting himself up with this venerable priest, he sought from heaven the resignation and courage he needed to pass through the final crisis. Madame Elisabeth showed the faithful Madame Campan the carnelian pin which fastened her fichu. These words, surrounding the stalk of a lily, were engraved on it: "Forget offences, pardon injuries." "I fear much," said the virtuous princess, "that this maxim has little influence over our enemies. It must be none the less dear to us." Louis XVI did not wear his padded vest. "I consented to do so on the 14th of July," said he, "because on that day I was merely going to a ceremony where an assassin's dagger might be apprehended. But on a day when my party may be forced to fight with the revolutionists, I should think it cowardly to preserve my life by such means." Marie Antoinette was grave and tranquil in her heroism. There was nothing affected about her, nothing theatrical, neither passion, despair, nor the spirit of revenge. According to the expressions of Roederer, who never left her, she was a woman, a mother, a wife in peril. She feared, she hoped, she grieved, and she took heart again. She was also a queen, and the daughter of Maria Theresa. Her anxiety and grief were restrained or concealed by her respect for her rank, her dignity, and her name. When she reappeared amidst the courtiers in the council hall, after having dissolved in tears in Thierry's room, the redness of her cheeks and eyes had disappeared. The courtiers said to each other, "What serenity! What courage!" The struggle might still seem doubtful. Something like 200 noblemen who had spontaneously repaired to the king, 750 Swiss, and 900 mounted gendarmes posted at the approaches of the Tuileries were the last resources of the commander-in-chief of the French army. The Swiss, who through someone's extreme imprudence had not cartridges enough, were posted in the apartments, the chapel, and at the entry of the royal court. Baron de Sailly, as the oldest captain of the regiment, commanded at the stairways. A reserve of 300 men under Captain Dulay was stationed in the Swiss court before the pavilion of Marsan. The National Guards belonging to the sections Petit Père and the Filles Saint-Thomas showed themselves well disposed toward the king. But it was different with the other companies. As to the mounted gendarmes, Louis XVI could not count on them, and before the riot ended they were to join the insurgents in spite of all the efforts made by their royalist officers. The artillerists of the National Guard, charged with serving the cannons placed in the courts and before the palace doors to defend the entry, were to act in the same manner. Like the Swiss, the 200 noblemen, martyrs to the old French ideas of honor, had resolved to be loyal unto death. With their silk coats and drawing-room swords, they seemed as if they had come to a fête instead of a combat. The servants of the chateau joined them. Some of them had pistols and blunderbusses. Some, for the lack of other weapons, had taken the tongs from the chimneys. They jested with each other over their accoutrements. No, no, there was nothing laughable in these champions of misfortune. They represented the past with its ancient fidelity to the altar and the throne. A great poet, who had the spirit of divination, Heinrich Heine, wrote on November 12, 1840, as if he foresaw February 24, 1848. The middle classes will possibly make less resistance than the aristocracy would do in a similar case. Even in its most pitiable weakness, its enervation by immorality, and its degeneration through flattery, the old nobility was still alive to a certain point of honor unknown to our middle classes, who have become prosperous by industry, but who will perish by it also. Another 10th of August is predicted for these middle classes, but I doubt whether the industrial knights of the throne of July will prove themselves as heroic as the powdered marquises of the old regime who, in silk coats and flimsy dress swords, opposed the people who invaded the Tuileries. The greater part of these noblemen, volunteers for the last conflict, were old men with white hair. There were also children among them. Monsieur Mortimer Ternaux, author of the Histoire de la Terreur, has remarked, "Was not this a time to exclaim with Racine, 'See what avengers arm themselves for the quarrel'?" Who could have told Louis XIV, when in the midst of the splendors of his court he was present at the performance of Athalie, that the poet was predicting, through the mouth of Joad, the fate reserved for his great-grandson? The royalist National Guards who were in the apartments considered the volunteer noblemen as companions in arms. They shook hands with each other, amid cries of "Long live the King! Long live the National Guard!" But the troops outside did not share these sentiments. Jealous of the royalists assembled in the palace, they wanted to have them sent out. A regimental commander having come to make known this desire to Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette exclaimed, "Nothing can separate us from these gentlemen. They are our most faithful friends. They will share the dangers of the National Guard. They will obey us. Put them at the cannon's mouth, and they will show you how men die for their king." Meantime, what had become of Pétion, whose business it was as mayor to defend the palace? Summoned to the Tuileries, he arrived there at 11 in the evening. As Louis XVI said to him, "It seems there is a great deal of commotion." "Yes, sire," he replied, "the excitement is great." And he enlarged upon the measures he claimed that he had taken, and his pretended haste to wait upon the king. In going out, he came face to face with M. de Mandat, who, as General-in-Chief of the National Guard, was in command of all military forces. "Why," exclaimed he, "have the police refused cartridges to the National Guard, when they have wasted them on the Marseillaise? My men have only 4 charges apiece, some of them have not one. No matter, I answer for everything. My measures are taken, providing I am authorized by an order signed by you to repel force by force." Not daring to avow his complicity with the riot, Pétion signed the order demanded. Then he made his escape under pretext of inspecting the gardens, and fell amongst some royalist National Guards, who reprimanded him severely. He began to fear being kept at the Tuileries as a hostage, to guarantee the palace against the attempts of the populace, and went to the Assembly. It had adjourned at 10 o'clock in the evening before, but on account of the crisis had met again at 2 in the morning. The Assembly knew the gravity of the danger as well as the king did, but through a ridiculous and culpable point of honor, it affected not to recognize it, and devoted to the reading of a colonial report the moments it should have employed in saving that constitution it had sworn to maintain. Pétion merely put in an appearance in the hall of the Manège, but he took good care not to return to the Tuileries. At 3:30 in the morning, the rolling of a carriage was heard from the palace. It was that of the mayor going back empty. He had not dared to get into it, and had only sent his coachman in order to return when he found himself in safety at the mayoralty, whither he had made his way on foot. Meanwhile, some 100 unknown individuals who gathered at the Hôtel de Ville had surreptitiously made their way into one of the halls, had formed an insurrectionary commune. On their own authority, they appointed commissaries of sections and dismissed the staff of the National Guard, who were very much known in their way, but retained in office Manuel as procurator and Pétion as mayor. This new municipality, whose very existence was unknown at the palace, had just learned that Mandat, General-in-Chief of the National Guard, had a document in his pocket by which Pétion authorized him to oppose force to force. It was necessary to get rid of this document at any cost. The municipality sent Mandat an order to come to the Hôtel de Ville. He knew nothing about the revolution that had just taken place there, and yet he hesitated to obey. A secret presentiment took possession of his soul. Finally, at the instance of Roederer, he decided towards 5 in the morning to leave the Tuileries and go to that Hôtel de Ville which was to be so fatal to him. When he came before the municipality, he was surprised to see new faces. He was accused of having intended to disperse the innocent and patriotic column of the people, and sentenced to be taken to the Abbey prison. It was a sentence of death. Mandat was massacred on the steps of the Hôtel de Ville. A pistol shot brought him down. Pikes and sabres finished him. His body was thrown into the Seine. Such was the first exploit of the new commune. It preluded thus the massacres of September. Mandat's death, says Count de Vaublanc in his memoirs, was, beyond any doubt, the chief cause of the calamities of the day. If he had attacked the rebels as soon as they came near the palace, he could have dispersed them with ease. They took a long time to form and set off. Being undecided and uneasy, they often halted. No troop marching from a given point in this immense city knew whether it was seconded by the rebels from other quarters, and lost much time in making sure. The second exploit of the Commune was to confine Pétion at the mayoralty under the guard of 6 men. A voluntary captive, this accomplice of the insurrection rejoiced at a measure which sheltered him from every danger. As M. Mortimer Tennot has observed, on this fatal night, when the passion of the royalty was fulfilled, Pétion doubled the parts of Judas and Pontius Pilate. Like Judas, he went at nightfall to give the kiss of peace to Louis XVI by assuring him of his loyalty. Like the Roman governor, he proclaimed at daybreak the impotence with which he had stricken himself, and washed his hands of all that was to happen. When the first fires of this fatal day were kindling in the sky, Marie Antoinette experienced a profound emotion. Looking with melancholy at the horizon which began to lighten, "Sister," said she to Madame Elisabeth, "come and see the sun rise." It was a sun that was to illuminate the death struggle of royalty. Sinister omen. The sun was red. End of chapter 27. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 28 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 28. The morning of August 10th. The fatal day began. It was 5 o'clock in the morning. The Queen made her children rise, lest the swords of the insurgents should surprise them in their beds. The Dauphin, unaccustomed to being called so early, stared with surprise at the spectacle presented by the court and garden. "Mamma," said he, "why should anyone harm Papa? He is so good." Then turning to a little girl who was his usual companion in his games, he addressed her these words, which prove how well, in spite of his age, he knew the peril he was in. "Here, Josephine, take this lock of my hair, and promise to wear it as long as I am in danger." Led by their chief, Marshal de Mailly, an old man of 86, the 200 noblemen who had assembled in the Gallery of Diana passed in review before the royal family with those of the National Guards who were royalists. "Sire," exclaimed the old marshal, bending his knee, "here are your faithful nobles who have hastened to re-establish your majesty on the throne of your ancestors." "For this once," responded Louis XVI, "I consent that my friends should defend me. We will perish or save ourselves together." The last defenders of the throne shed tears of fidelity and tenderness. They kneeled before Marie Antoinette and entreated the honor of kissing her hand. Never had the Queen appeared more gracious and majestic. The National Guards, enchanted, loaded their arms with transport. The Queen seized the Dauphin in her arms and held him above their heads like a living standard. The young men shouted, "Long live the King of our fathers!" and the old men cried, "Long live the King of our children!" At the gates of the Tuileries the tide was rising. Vanguards of the insurrection, the Marseillais, arrived unhindered. The municipality had succeeded in removing the cannons which were to have prevented approach by way of the Pont Neuf and the Pont Royal. Mandat was no longer there to issue orders. Nothing impeded the march of the faubourgs. And yet resistance might still have been possible. It is Barbaroux, the fierce revolutionist himself, who says so. All the faults committed by the insurrection, the wretched arrangement of the attacking party, the terror of some and the ignorance of others, the forces at the palace, all made the victory of the court certain. If the king had not left his post, if he had shown himself on horseback, a large majority of the people of Paris would have pronounced for him. Napoleon, who was an eye-witness, had said the night before to Pozzo di Borgo that with 2 battalions of Swiss and some cavalry he would undertake to give the rioters a lesson they would remember. In the evening of August 10th he wrote to his brother Joseph, "According to what I saw of the temper of the crowd in the morning, if Louis XVI had mounted a horse, he would have gained the victory." Very few of the insurgents were seriously determined on a revolt. Most of them marched blindly, not knowing and not even asking whither they went. Westermann had been obliged to threaten Santerre, and even put his sword against his breast in order to induce him to march. A great number of the people of the faubourgs, uneasy as to the result of the enterprise, said that, considering the preparations made by the palace, it would be better to defer the matter to another day. The unarmed crowd followed through mere curiosity, and were ready to take flight at the first discharge of musketry. According to Count de Vaublanc, the Swiss, if they had been commanded by a good officer from 4 o'clock in the morning, would have sufficed to disperse the multitude as they came up, and possibly might have won the day for the king without bloodshed. Thus the best of princes rendered useless the courage of his defenders, and to spare the blood of his enemies accomplished the ruin of his friends. All his virtues turned against him, and brought him to his ruin. M. de Vaublanc says again in his Memoirs, "At 6 in the morning, those who were in revolt had not yet assembled. How much time had been lost? How much was still to be lost? It was too evident that no military judgment had presided over the strange disposition of troops so placed within and without the palace as to be unable to give each other mutual support. A military man knows too well the value of the briefest moments. He knows too well how quickly victory can be decided by attacking the flank of a multitude with a small number of brave men. If the king had appointed one of the generals near him absolute master of operations, no doubt this general would have given the rebels no time to unite. Alas, Louis XVI had 3 times more courage than was necessary to conquer, but he knew not how to avail himself of it. Such was also the opinion of Mr. Thiers, who in his Histoire de la Révolution Française says, "It must be repeated, the unfortunate prince feared nothing for himself. He had in fact refused to wear a wadded vest as he had done on July 14th, saying that on a day of combat he ought to be as much exposed as the least of his servants. Courage did not fail him then, and afterwards he displayed a bravery that was noble and elevated enough, but he lacked the boldness to take the offensive. It is certain, as has been frequently said, that if he had mounted a horse and charged at the head of his troops, the insurrection would have been put down." Towards 6 o'clock the king went out on the balcony. He was saluted with acclamation. Then he went down the great staircase with the queen to inspect the troops stationed in the courtyards. As one of his gentlemen of the chamber, Emmanuel Aubier, has remarked, he had never made war himself during his reign. There had never been a war on the continent. He was so unfortunate as to be wanting in grace, even awkward, and to look thoughtful rather than energetic, a thing displeasing to French soldiers. Instead of putting on a uniform and mounting a horse, he wore a purple coat, of the shade used in mourning for kings, on this fatal day when he was to wear mourning for the monarchy. Unspurred, unbooted, shod as if for a drawing-room, with white silk stockings, his hat under his arm, his hair out of curl and badly powdered, there was nothing martial, nothing royal about him. At this hour, when what was needed was the attitude and the fire of a King Henry IV, he looked like an honest country gentleman talking with his farmers. The first condition of inspiring confidence is to possess it. Louis XVI's aspect was much more that of a victim than a sovereign. The cries of "Long live the king," which would have been enthusiastic for a prince ready to battle for his rights and reconquer his realm at the sword's point, were few and sad. After having inspected the troops in the court, Louis XVI decided to inspect those in the garden too. The queen returned to the palace, and he continued his rounds. The loyal National Guards, comprising the companies of the Petit Père and the Filles Saint-Thomas, were drawn up on the terrace between the palace and the garden. They received the king sympathetically, and advised him to continue his inspection as far as the Place Louis XV. At this moment a battalion of the National Guards from the Saint-Marceau section defiled before him, uttering shouts of hatred and fury. Louis XVI was undisturbed by this. He remained calm, and when this battalion had got into position, he tranquilly reviewed it. Then he walked on again and crossed the entire garden. The battalion of the Croix Rouge, which was on the terrace beside the water, cried from a distance, "Down with the veto! Down with the traitor!" On the terrace of the Feuillants, at the other side, there was an equally violent crowd. The king, calm as ever, went on to the swing bridge by which the Tuileries was entered from Place Louis XV. He was well enough received by the troops stationed there, but his return to the palace could not but be difficult. The National Guards of the Croix Rouge had broken rank and come down from the terrace beside the river to the garden and pressed around the king with menacing shouts. The unfortunate monarch could only re-enter the palace, where he had but a few moments more to stay, by calling to his aid a double row of faithful grenadiers. The ministers who were at the windows became alarmed. One of them, M. de Bouchage, cried, "Great God, it is the king they are hooting. What the devil are they doing down there? Quick, we must go after him." And he hastened to descend into the garden with his colleague, Bigot de Sainte Croix, to meet his master. The queen, who beheld the sight, shed tears. The two ministers brought back Louis XVI. He came in out of breath and fatigued by the heat and the exercise he had taken, but otherwise seeming very little moved. All is lost, said the queen. This review has done more harm than good. From this moment bad tidings succeeded each other without interruption. They were apprised of the formation of the new Commune, Mondard's murder, the march of the Faubourg, and the arrival of the first detachment of rioters. The Marseillais debouched into the Carrousel and sent an envoy to demand that the gate of the royal court should be opened. As it remained closed, they knocked on it with repeated blows, while the National Guards said, "We will not fire on our brothers." Would resistance have been possible even at this moment, that is to say, between 7 and 8 in the morning? M. de Vaublanc thought so. "I do not know," he writes, "to what section the first band that arrived on the Carrousel belonged. It was in disorder and badly armed. If the king had marched toward his troop at the head of a battalion of the National Guard, if he had pronounced these words, 'I am your king, I order you to lay down your arms,' the success would have been decided. The flight of a single battalion of rebels would have sufficed to frighten and disperse the others even before they were formed into line." It was at this time that Roederer, instead of counselling resistance, implored Louis XVI to seek shelter in the Assembly for the royal family. "Sire," he said in an urgent tone, "your Majesty has not 5 minutes to lose. There is no safety for you except in the National Assembly. In the opinion of the department, it is necessary to go there without delay. There are not men enough in the courtyards to defend the palace, nor are they perfectly well disposed. On the mere recommendation to be on the defensive, the cannoneers have already unloaded their cannons." "But," said the king, "I did not see many persons on the Carrousel." "Sire," returned Roederer, "there are a dozen pieces of artillery, and an immense crowd is arriving from the faubourgs." The idea of a flight before the insurrection revolted the queen's pride. "What are you saying, sir?" cried she. "You are proposing that we should seek shelter with our most cruel persecutors. Never, never. I will be nailed to these walls before I consent to leave them. Sir, we have troops. Madame, all Paris is on the march. Resistance is impossible. Will you cause the massacre of the king, your children, and your servants?" Louis XVI, still hesitating, Roederer vehemently insisted. "Sire," said he, "time presses. This is no longer an entreaty nor even a counsel we take the liberty of offering you. There is only one thing left for us to do now, and we ask your permission to take you away." The king looked fixedly at his interlocutor for several seconds. Then turning to the queen, he said, "Let us go," and rose to his feet. Madame Elisabeth said, "Monsieur Roederer, do you answer for the king's life?" "Yes, madame, with my own," responded the communal attorney. Then turning to the king, "Sire," said he, "I ask your Majesty not to take any of your court with you, but to have no cortege but the department and no escort except the National Guard." "Yes," replied the king, "there is nothing but that to say." The Minister of Justice exclaimed, "The ministers will follow the king. Yes, they have a place in the Assembly. And Madame de Tourzel, my children's governess," said the queen. "Yes, madame, she will accompany you." Roederer then left the king's chamber, where this conversation had taken place, and said in a loud voice to the persons crowding together in the council hall, "The king and his family are going to the Assembly without other attendants than the department, the ministers, and a guard." Then he said, "Is the officer who commands the guard here?" This officer presenting himself, he said to him, "You must bring forward a double file of National Guards to accompany the king. The king desires it." The officer replied, "It shall be done." Louis XVI came out of his chamber with his family. He waited several minutes in the hall until the guards should arrive, and going around the circle composed of some 40 or 50 persons belonging to his court, "Come, gentlemen," said he, "there is nothing more to do here." The queen, turning to Madame Campan, said, "Wait in my apartment. I will rejoin you, or else send word to go, I don't know where." Marie Antoinette took no one with her except the Princess de Lamballe and Madame de Tourzel. The Princess de Tarente and Madame de la Roche-Aymon, afflicted at the thought of being left at the Tuileries, went down with all the other ladies to the queen's apartments on the ground floor. La Chesnaye, who had succeeded to the command of the National Guard in consequence of Mondard's death, put himself at the head of the escort. This was formed of detachments from the most loyal battalions, the Petit Père, the Suite de Moulins, and the Fils Saint-Thomas, reinforced by about 200 Swiss, commanded by the colonel of the regiment, Marquis de Maillardoz, and the major, Baron de Bachmann. The cortège reached the great staircase by way of the council hall, the royal bedchamber, the Œil de Bœuf, the hall of the guards, and the hall of the 100 Swiss. As he was passing through the Œil de Bœuf, Louis XVI took the hat of the National Guard on his right and placed it on his own, which was adorned with white feathers. The guard, surprised, removed the king's hat from his head and carried it under his arm. When Louis XVI arrived at the foot of the stairs in the pavilion of the Horloge, his thoughts recurred to the faithful adherents who had so uselessly devoted themselves to his defense, and whom he was leaving at the Tuileries without watchword or direction. "What is going to become of all those who have stayed upstairs?" said he. "Sire," said Roederer, "it seems to me that they were all in coloured coats. Those who have swords need only lay them off, follow you, and go out through the garden." "That is true," returned Louis XVI. In the vestibule a little further on, as he was about to quit the fatal palace which fate had condemned him never to re-enter, he had at last a moment of scruple and hesitation. He said again: "But after all, there are not many people on the Carrousel." "True, sire," replied Roederer, "but the faubourgs will soon arrive, and all the sections are armed and have assembled at the municipality. Besides, there are neither men enough here, nor are they determined enough to resist the actual gathering on the Carrousel, which has 12 pieces of artillery. The die is cast. Louis XVI abandoned the Tuileries. Respect alone restrains the grief and indignation that move the Swiss soldiers and the noblemen whose weapons and whose blood have been refused. They look down from the windows at the cortège, or better, the funeral procession of royalty. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning. The escort was drawn up in 2 lines. The members of the department formed a circle around the royal family. Roederer walked first. Then came the king, with Bigot de Sainte Croix, Minister of Foreign Affairs, at his side. The queen followed, giving her left arm to Monsieur de Bourges, Minister of Marine, and her right hand to the Dauphin, who held Madame de Tourzel with the other. Then Madame Royale and Madame Elisabeth, with de Joly, Minister of Justice, and the Minister of War, d'Abancourt leading the Princess de Lamballe. The Ministers of the Interior and of Taxes, Champion de Villeneuve, and Leroux de la Ville, closed the procession. The air was pure and the morning radiant. The sun lighted up the garden, the marble sculpture, and the sheets of water. Birds sang under the trees, and nature smiled on this day of mourning as if it were a festival. Looking at the populace, Madame Elisabeth said: "All those people have gone astray. I should like them to be converted. I should not like them to be punished." Tears stood in the eyes of the little Madame Royale. The Princess de Lamballe said mournfully: "We shall never return to the Tuileries." The Prince de Poix, the Duc de Choiseul, Counts d'Aussonville, de Vermenil, de Evilly, de Pont-l'Abbé, the Marquis de Briges, Chevalier de Fleurieux, Viscount de Saint-Priest, the Marquis de Nantouillet, Messieurs de Fresnes and de Salagnac, the King's equerries, and Saint-Pardoux, the equerry of Madame Elisabeth, followed the sad procession. They passed through the grand alley unobstructed as far as the parterre, then turned to the right toward the alley of the chestnut trees. There a halt of some minutes occurred in order to give time for warning the assembly. Louis XVI looked down at a heap of dead leaves which had been swept up by the gardeners after a storm the night before. "There are a good many leaves," said the king. "They are falling early this year." It was only a few days before that Manuel had written in a journal that the king would not last until the falling of the leaves. Perhaps Louis XVI remembered the prophecy of the revolutionists. The Dauphin, with a carelessness belonging to his age, amused himself by kicking about the dead leaves, the leaves that had fallen as his father's crown was falling at this moment. Before the royal family could enter the assembly chamber, it was necessary that the step the king had taken should be announced to the deputies. The president of the department undertook this commission. A deputation of 24 members was at once sent to meet Louis XVI. They found him in the large alley at the foot of the terrace of the Feuillants, a few steps from the staircase leading up to it, and which goes as far as the lobby through which one enters the hall occupied by the National Assembly. "Sire," said the leader of the deputation, "the Assembly, eager to contribute to your safety, offers to you and your family an asylum in its midst." During this time, the terrace and the staircase had become thronged by a furious crowd. A man carrying a long pole cried out in rage: "No, no, they shall not enter the Assembly. They are the cause of all our troubles. This must be ended. Down with them." Roederer, standing on the 4th step of the staircase, cried: "Citizens, I demand silence in the name of the law." You seem disposed to prevent the king and his family from entering the National Assembly. You are not justified in opposing it. The king has a place there in virtue of the Constitution, and though his family has none legally, they have just been authorized by a decree to go there. Here are the deputies sent to meet the king. They will attest the existence of this decree." The deputies confirmed his words. Nevertheless, the crowd still hesitated to leave the way clear. The man with the pole kept on brandishing it and crying, "Down with them! Down with them!" Roederer, going on to the terrace, snatched the pole and flung it into the garden. The crowd was so compact that in the midst of the squabble someone stole the queen's watch and her purse. A man with a sinister face approached the Dauphin, took him from Marie Antoinette, and lifted him in his arms. The queen uttered a cry. "Do not be frightened," said the man. "I will do him no harm." Another person said to Louis XVI, "Sire, we are honest men, but we are not willing to be betrayed any longer. Be a good citizen, and don't forget to drive away your shavelings and your wife." Insults and threats resounded from all sides. Finally, after an actual struggle, the royal family succeeded in opening a passage. They made their way with difficulty through the narrow lobby, choked with people, penetrated the crowd, and entered the session chamber. It was there that royalty, humiliated and overcome, was to lie at the point of death under the eyes of its implacable enemies. End of chapter 28, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 29 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 29. The Box of the Logograph. The royal family had just entered the session chamber. It will find there not an asylum, but the vestibule of the prison and the scaffold. The man who had taken the Dauphin from the Queen's arms at the door of the assembly set him down on the secretary's desk with an air of triumph, and the young prince was greeted with applause. Marie Antoinette advanced with dignity. According to Vaublanc's expression, she would not have had a different bearing or a more august serenity on a day of royal pomp. Louis XVI took a place near the president. The Queen, her daughter, Madame Elisabeth, and Madame de Tourzel sat down on the ministerial benches. As soon as the Dauphin was left to himself, he sprang towards his mother. A voice cried, "Take him to the king. The Austrian woman is unworthy of the people's confidence." An usher attempted to obey this injunction. However, the child began to cry. People were affected, and he was allowed to remain with the Queen. At this moment, some armed noblemen made their appearance at the extremity of the hall. "You promised the king's safety," exclaimed someone, and the nobles retired. Order was restored. Louis XVI began to speak. "I came here," said he, "to prevent a great crime, and I think that I could be nowhere more secure than amidst the representatives of the nation. Alas, the crime will not be prevented, but only adjourned." Vergniaud occupied the president's chair. "Sire," he replied, "you may count on the firmness of the National Assembly. It knows its duties. Its members have been sworn to die in defending the rights of the people and the constituted authorities. So they still call Louis XVI sire. Presently they will call him nothing but Louis Capet. They allow him to take an armchair near the president, but in a few minutes they will find this place too good for him. And it is the voice of this very Vergniaud who, a few hours from now, will pronounce his deposition, and 5 months later his sentence of death." Hardly had the unhappy king sat down when Chabot, the unfrocked Capuchin, claimed that a clause of the Constitution forbade the Assembly to deliberate in the presence of the sovereign. Under this pretext his place was changed, and Louis XVI, with all his family, was shut up in the reporters' gallery, sometimes called the Box of the Logograph. This miserable hole, about 6 feet high by 12 wide, was on a level with the last ranks of the Assembly, behind the president's chair and the seats of the secretaries. It was ordinarily set apart for the editors, or rather for the stenographers of a great newspaper which reported the proceedings, and which was called the Journal Logographique or the Logotachygraphe, usually abbreviated into the Logograph. Louis XVI seated himself in the front of the box, Marie Antoinette half concealed herself in a corner, where she sought a little shelter against so many humiliations. Her children and their governess took places on a bench with Madame Elisabeth and the Princess de Lamballe. Several noblemen, the latest courtiers of misfortune, stood up behind them. Roederer, who was at the bar, then made a report in the name of the municipal department, in which he explained that all had taken place. He declared that he had said to the soldiers and National Guard detailed for the defense of the Tuileries, "We do not ask you to shed the blood of your brethren, nor to attack your fellow citizens. Your cannons are there for your defense, not for an attack. But I require this defense in the name of the law, in the name of the Constitution. The law authorizes you, when violence is used against you, to repress it vigorously. Once more, you are not to be assailants, but to act on the defensive only." Roederer added that the cannoneers, instead of complying with his urgent exhortations, gave no response save that of unloading their pieces before him. After having explained how greatly the defense was disorganized, he thus ended his report. "We felt ourselves no longer in a position to protect the charge confided to us. This charge was the king. The king is a man. This man is a father. The children ask us to assure the existence of the father. The law asks us to assure the existence of the King of France. Humanity asks of us the existence of the man. No longer able to defend this charge, no other idea presented itself than that of entreating the king to come with his family to the National Assembly. We have nothing to add to what I have just said, except that, our force being paralyzed and no longer in existence, we can have none but that which it shall please the National Assembly to communicate. We are ready to die in the execution of the orders it may give us. We ask, while awaiting them, to remain near it, being useless everywhere else." The Assembly, not then suspecting that it would so soon depose Louis XVI, applauded without contradiction from the galleries. The President said to Roederer, "The Assembly has listened to your account with the greatest interest. It invites you to be present at the session." The advice given by Roederer to the king has been greatly blamed. The event has seriously influenced the judgment since passed upon it. If Louis XVI had received the support he had a right to count on from the representatives, things would have appeared in quite another light. Count de Vaublanc, in his memoirs, has rendered full justice to the royal intentions of the municipal attorney. "The advice he gave has been accounted a crime," says M. de Vaublanc. "I think it is an unjust reproach. Until then, he had done all that lay in his power to contribute to the defense of the palace. He must have seen clearly that as the king would not defend himself, he could no longer be defended. If the rebels had been attacked, neither M. Roederer nor anyone else would have proposed going to the Assembly. But since they were on the defensive and without any recognized leader, the magistrate might doubtless have been struck with a single thought: the king and his family are about to be massacred. The king put an end to all irresolution in saying these words: 'There is nothing more to do here.' At first Louis XVI seemed not to repent of the step he had been obliged to take. Even in that wretched hole, the Logograph box, his face at first was calm and even confident. As the shouting had increased outside, Vergniaud ordered the removal of the iron grating separating this box from the hall, so that in case the populace made an irruption into the lobbies, the king could take refuge in the midst of the deputies. In default of workmen and tools, the deputies nearest at hand, the Duc de Choiseul, Prince de Poix, and the ministers undertook to tear away the grating, and Louis XVI himself, accustomed to the rough work of a locksmith, joined his efforts to theirs. The fastenings having been broken in this manner, the unfortunate sovereign seemed not to doubt the sentiments of the National Assembly. He pointed out the most remarkable deputies to the Dauphin, chatted with several among them, and looked on at the session like a mere spectator in a box at the theatre. The royal family had been nearly 2 hours at the Assembly, when all of a sudden a frightful discharge of musketry and artillery was heard. The deputies of the left grew pale with fear and anger, thinking themselves betrayed. Casting glances of uneasiness and wrath at the feeble monarch, they accused him of having ordered a massacre, and said that all was lost. An officer of the National Guard rushed in crying, "We are pursued, we are overpowered." The galleries, affrighted, imagined that the Swiss would arrive at any moment. Excitement was at its height. Sinister, imposing, dreadful moment. Solemn hour, when the monarchy amidst a frightful tempest was like a venerable oak which lightning had just stricken. when terror, wrath, and pity disputed the possession of men's souls, and when the king, already captive, was present like Charles V at his own funeral. Marie Antoinette had started. At the sound of the cannon her cheeks kindled and her eyes blazed. A vague hope animated her. Perhaps, she said within herself, the monarchy is at last to be avenged. Perhaps the Swiss are about to give the insurrection a lesson it will remember. Perhaps Louis XVI will re-enter in triumph the palace of his forefathers. The daughters of Caesars prayed God in silence and supplicated him to grant victory to the defenders of the throne. Chimeras, vain hopes. Louis XVI has no longer but one idea: to cast off all responsibility for events. He mustered up, so to say, the little authority he had yet remaining to write hastily in pencil the last order he was to sign, the order to stop firing. He flattered himself that the prohibition to shoot would justify him completely in the sight of the National Assembly and induce them to treat him with more consideration. But he asked himself anxiously who would be bold enough to carry his orders as far as the palace. Would not so perilous a mission intimidate even the most heroic? M. d'Hervilly, who was at this moment in the box of the Logograph, offered himself. As the king and queen at first refused his offer, and pointed out all the dangers of such an errand. "I beg their majesties," cried he, "not to think of my danger. My duty is to brave everything in their service. My place is in the midst of the firing, and if I were afraid of it, I should be unworthy of my uniform." These words determined Louis XVI to give M. d'Hervilly the order signed by his own hand. The valiant nobleman, bearing this order which was to have such disastrous consequences for the defenders of the palace, went hastily out of the assembly hall and made his way to the Tuileries through a rain of balls and canister. End of chapter 29. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 30 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Humbert Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 30. The Combat. What had taken place at the Tuileries after the departure of the royal family for the Assembly? At the very moment when they abandoned this place, which they were never to see again, the Marseillais, the vanguard of the insurrection, were pounding at the gate of the principal courtyard, furious because it was not opened. A few minutes later, the column of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, after passing through the Rue Saint-Honoré, debouched on the Carrousel. It was under the command of the Pole, Lazouski, and Westermann, who directed it toward the gate of the royal court. As the Marseillais had not yet succeeded in forcing this, Westermann had it broken open. The cannoneers, whose business it was to defend the palace, at once declared on the side of the riot and turned their pieces against the Tuileries. With the exception of the domestics, there were now in the palace only 750 Swiss and about 100 National Guards and a few nobles. The sole instructions the Swiss received came from old Marshal de Mailly. "Do not let yourselves be taken." Louis XVI had said absolutely nothing on going away, and his departure discouraged his most faithful adherents. Add to this that the Swiss had not enough cartridges. What was to be the fate of this fine regiment, this corps d'élite, where everywhere and always had set the example of discipline and military honor, which ever since the Revolution began had haughtily repulsed every attempt to tamper with it, and whose red uniforms alone struck terror into the populace? These brave soldiers guarded respectfully the traditions of their ancestors, who at the famous retreat of Meaux had saved Charles IX. "But for my good friends the Swiss," said that prince, "my life and liberty would have been in a bad way." What the Swiss of the 16th century had done for one king of France, the Swiss of the 18th century would have done for his successor. They would have saved Louis XVI if he would have let himself be saved. A major general who had remained at the Tuileries, judging that it was impossible to defend the courts with so few soldiers, cried, "Gentlemen, retire to the palace." They had to leave 6 cannon in the power of the enemy and to abandon the courts. it would have been foreseen that it would be necessary to retake these under penalty of being burned in the palace. The common soldiers said so loudly. Meanwhile they obeyed, and were disposed as well as time as the localities permitted. The stairs and windows were lined with soldiers. Account of Colonel Pfeiffer d'Altishoffen, published at Lucerne in 1819. One post occupied the chapel, another the vestibule and grand staircase. There were Swiss also at the windows looking into the courts. "Down with the Swiss!" cried the Marseillais. "Down, down, surrender!" However, the struggle had not yet begun. Nearly 15 minutes elapsed between the invasion of the royal court and the first shot. The Marseillais brandished their pikes and guns, but they were not confident, for at first they dared not cross the court more than halfway. The Swiss and National Guards who were at the windows made gestures to induce the populace to quiet down and go away. The throng of insurgents grew greater every minute. They had just got their cannon into battery against the Tuileries. What the Swiss especially intended was to defend the grand staircase, so as to prevent the apartments of the first floor from being invaded. This staircase, afterwards destroyed, was in the middle of the vestibule of the Horloge Pavilion. The chapel, whose site was afterwards changed, was on the level of the first landing, and from this landing 2 symmetrical flights at right angles with the first led to the hall of the 100 Swiss, the future hall of the marshals. Westermann, bolder than the other insurgents, had advanced as far as the vestibule with several Marseillais. He began to parley with the soldiers, trying to set them against their officers and induce them to lay down their arms. Sergeant Blazer answered Westermann, "We are Swiss," and the Swiss only lay down their weapons with their lives. The officers caused a barricade of pieces of wood to be raised on the first landing at the head of the stairs, to prevent new deputations from coming to demoralize their men. The Marseillais attempted to take it by main force. Some of them were armed with halberds terminating in hooks. These they thrust below the barricade, trying to catch the men defending it. They seized an adjutant in this way and disarmed him. At the foot of the stairs they seized the first Swiss entry, and afterwards 5 others. They lay hold of them with hooked pikes, which they thrust into their coats and drew them forwards, disarming them at once of their sabres, guns, and cartridge boxes, amidst shouts of laughter. Encouraged by the success of this forlorn hope, the whole crowd pressed towards the foot of the stairs, and there massacred the 5 Swiss already taken and disarmed. M. Peltier's relation. Then a pistol shot was heard. From which side did it come? Was it the Marseillais who provoked the combat? Was it the Swiss who sought to avenge their comrades, the sentries? Whoever it was, this pistol shot was signal for the fight, which began about 10:30 in the morning. At first the Swiss had the advantage. Every shot they fired from the windows told. Among the people crowding the courtyards were many who had not come to fight, but through mere curiosity. Pale with fright, they fled towards the Carrousel, through the gates of the royal court, which was strewn in an instant with guns, pikes, and cartridge boxes. Some of the insurgents fell flat on their faces and counterfeited death, rising occasionally and gliding along the walls to gain the sentry boxes of the mounted sentinels as best they could. Even the majority of the cannoneers deserted their pieces and ran like the rest. The courts were cleared in an instant. 2 Swiss officers, Monsieur de Doulay and de Pfeiffer, instantly made a sortie at the head of 120 soldiers, took 4 cannon, and found themselves once more masters of the door of the royal court. A detachment of 60 soldiers formed themselves into a hollow square before this door, and kept up a rolling fire on the rioters remaining on the Carrousel until the place was completely swept. At the same time, on the side of the garden, another detachment of Swiss under Count de Sailly seized 3 cannon and brought them to the palace gate. Napoleon, who witnessed the combat from a distance, says, "The Swiss handled their artillery with vigor. In 10 minutes the Marseillais were chased as far as the Rue de l'Echelle, and never came back until the Swiss were withdrawn by the king's order." It was now, in fact, that Monsieur d'Evilly arrived, hatless and unarmed, through the fusillade of grape. They wanted to show him the dispositions they had just made on the garden side. "There is no question of that," said he. "You must go to the Assembly. It is the king's order." the unfortunate soldiers flattered themselves that they might still be of use. "Yes, brave Swiss," cried Baron de Vieux-Mesnil, "go and find the king. Your ancestors did so more than once." In spite of their chagrin at abandoning the field of which they had just become masters, they obeyed. Their only thought was to repair to that assembly, where a last humiliation awaited them. The officers had the drums beat the call to arms, and, in spite of the rain of balls from every side, they succeeded in marshalling the soldiers as if for a dress parade in front of the palace opposite the garden. The signal for departure was given. An unforeseen peril was reserved for these heroes. The battalions of the National Guard, stationed at the door of the Pont Royal, at that of the Manège Court, at the beginning of the terrace of the Feuillants, had stood still, with their weapons grounded, since the affray began. But hardly had the Swiss entered the Grand Alley than these battalions, neutral until now, detailed a number of individuals who hid behind the trees and fired, with their muzzles almost touching the troops. On reaching the middle of the alley, the Swiss, who hardly deigned to return this fire, divided into two columns. The first, turning to the right under the trees, went towards the staircase leading to the assembly from the terrace of the Feuillants. The second, which followed at a short distance and acted as a rear guard, went on as far as the Place Louis XV, where it found the mounted gendarmes. If this body of cavalry had done its duty, it would have united with the Swiss, but far from that. It declared for the insurrection and sabred them. It is said that the officers and soldiers killed in this retreat across the garden were interred at the foot of the famous chestnut whose exceptional forwardness had earned the surname of the Tree of March 20th. Thus the Bonapartist tree of popular tradition owes its astonishing strength of vegetation solely to the human compost furnished by the corpses of the last defenders of royalty. The first column, that which was on its way to the assembly, presented itself resolutely in front of the terrace of the Feuillants, which was full of people. These took flight, and the Swiss entered the corridors of the assembly. Carried away by his zeal, one of the officers, Baron de Sailly, entered the hall with his naked sword in his hand. The left uttered a cry of affright. A deputy went out to order the commander, Baron de Durlay, to make his troop lay down their arms. Monsieur de Durlay having refused, he was conducted to the king. "Sire," said he, with sorrowful indignation, "they want me to lay down arms." Louis XVI responded, "Put them in the hands of the National Guard. I am not willing that brave men like you should perish." To surrender arms, did Louis XVI fully comprehend that for soldiers like these such an outrage was 100 times worse than death? The king's words were like a thunderbolt to them. They wept with rage. "But," said they, "even if we have no more cartridges, we can still defend ourselves with our bayonets." Such devotion, such courage, such discipline, such heroism to end like this. And yet the unfortunate Swiss, though grieved to the heart, resigned themselves to the last sacrifice their master required from their fidelity, lay down their arms, and were imprisoned in the ancient church of the Feuillants to the number of about 250. It was all that remained of this magnificent regiment. The others had been killed in the garden or had their throats cut in the palace, and the greater part of the survivors were to be assassinated in the massacres of September. Thus ended the French king's regiment of Swiss Guards, like one of those sturdy oaks whose prolonged existence had affronted so many storms, and which nothing but an earthquake can uproot. It fell the very day on which the ancient French monarchy also fell. It counted more than a century and a half of faithful services rendered to France. To destroy this worthy corps, a combination of unfortunate events had been required. It had been necessary to deprive the Swiss of their artillery, their ammunition, their staff, and the presence of the king, to enfeeble them 5 days before the combat by sending away a detachment of 300 men, to forbid the 200 men who accompanied the king to the assembly to fire a shot, to render useless the wise dispositions of Messieurs de Maillardoz and de Bachmann by an ill-advised order at the moment of the attack, and to have Monsieur d'Evilly come at the moment of victory to divide and enfeeble the defense. Relation of Colonel Pfeiffer d'Altishoffen. The Swiss Republic has honored the memory of these sons who died for a king. At the entrance of Lucerne, in the side of a rock, a grotto has been hollowed out, in which may be seen a colossal stone lion, the work of Thorvaldsen, the famous Danish sculptor. This lion, struck by a lance and lying down to die, holds tight within his claws the royal escutcheon upon a shield adorned with fleurs-de-lis. Underneath the lion are engraved the names of the Swiss officers and soldiers who died between August 10th and September 2nd, 1792. Above it may be read this inscription cut in the rock: Helvetiorum fidei ac virtuti, to the fidelity and the courage of the Swiss. Louis XVI had to repent his weakness bitterly. The wretched monarch had at last reached the bottom of the abyss where the slippery descent of concession ends, and for having been willing to spare the blood of a few criminals, he was to see that of his most loyal and faithful adherents shed in torrents. It is said that Napoleon, who witnessed the combat from a distance, cried several times, in speaking of Louis XVI, "What then, wretched man? Have you no cannon to sweep out this rabble?" Behind the people of the 10th of August, the man of Brumaire already appeared as a conqueror. Work away then, insurgents. This unknown young man, this straight-haired Corsican, hidden in the crowd, will be the master of you all. He will crush the revolution. He will make himself all-powerful in that palace of the Tuileries, where the riot is lauding it at this moment. And after him, the brother of the king whom you insult today and will kill tomorrow, the Count de Provence, the émigré who is the object of your hatred, will triumphantly enter the palace of his forefathers. And each of them, in his turn, the Corsican gentleman and the brother of Louis XVI, will be received with the same transports in that fatal palace, which is now red with the blood of the Swiss. How surprised these people would be if they could foresee what the future has in store for them. Among these frenzied demagogues, these ultra-revolutionists, these dishevelled Marseillais with lips blackened by powder and jackets all blood, how many will be the fanatical admirers and soldiers of a Caesar? End of chapter 30. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 31 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 31. The results of the combat. The results of the combat were, at the Assembly, the decree of suspension, or rather the decree of deposition; at the Tuileries, devastation, massacre, and conflagration. From the moment when he ordered his last defenders to lay down their arms, Louis XVI was but the phantom of a king. While the fight was going on, Robespierre had remained in hiding. Marat had not quitted the bottom of a cellar. Even Danton, the man of audacity, did not show himself until after the last shot had been fired. But now that fate had declared for the revolution, those who were trembling and hesitating a moment since were those who talked the loudest. Louis XVI, who had been dreaded a few minutes ago, was insulted and jeered at. The National Assembly, royalist in the morning, became the accomplice of the Republicans during the day. It perceived, moreover, that the 10th of August was aimed at it not less than at the throne, and that its own downfall would be contemporaneous with that of royalty. Huguenin, the president of the new commune, came boldly to the bar and said to the deputies, "The people is your sovereign as well as ours." Another individual, likewise at the bar, exclaimed in a menacing tone, "For a long time the people has asked you to pronounce the deposition, and you have not even yet pronounced the suspension. Know that the Tuileries is on fire, and that we shall not extinguish it until the vengeance of the people has been satisfied." Vergniaud, who in the morning had promised the king the support of the Assembly, no longer even attempted to stem the revolutionary tide. He came down from the president's chair and went to a desk to write the decree which should give a legislative form to the will of the insurrection. In virtue of this decree, which Vergniaud read from the tribune, and which was unanimously adopted, the royal power was suspended, and a national convention convoked. In reality, this was a veritable deposition, and yet the assembly still hesitated to give the last shock which should uproot the royal tree that had sheltered beneath its branches so many faithful generations. It declared that in default of a civil list, a salary should be granted to the king during his suspension, that Louis XVI and his family should have a palace, the Luxembourg, for a resident, and that he should be appointed governor of the Prince Royal. Concerning this, Madame de Staël has remarked in her Considérations sur les principaux événements de la Révolution française, ambition for power mingled with the enthusiasm of principles in the Republican of 1792, and several among them offered to maintain royalty if all the ministerial places were given to their friends. The throne they attacked served to shelter them, and it was not until after they had triumphed that they found themselves exposed before the people. What the Girondins wanted was merely a chance in the ministry. It was not a revolution. Vergniaud felt that he had been distanced. When he read the act of deposition, his voice was sad, his attitude dejected, and his action feeble. Did he foresee that the king and himself would die at the same place, on the same scaffold, only 9 months apart? Louis XVI listened to the invectives launched against him, and to the decree depriving him of royal power, without a change of color. At the very moment when the vote was taken, he bent towards Deputy Coustar, who sat beside the box of the Logograph, and said with the greatest tranquillity, "What you are doing there is not very constitutional." Impassive, and speaking of himself as of a king who had lived 1,000 years before, he leaned his elbows on the front of the box and looked on, like a disinterested spectator, at the lugubrious spectacle that was unrolled before him. Marie Antoinette, on the contrary, was shuddering. So long as the combat lasted, a secret hope had thrilled her. But when she saw them bringing to the assembly and laying on the table the jewel cases, trinkets, and portfolios which the insurgents had just taken from her bedroom at the Tuileries, when she heard the victorious cries of the rioters, when Vergniaud's voice sounded in her ears like a funeral knell, she could hardly contain her grief and indignation. For one instant she closed her eyes, but presently she haughtily raised her head. The tide was rising, rising incessantly. Petitioners demanded sometimes the deposition and sometimes the death of the king. This dialogue was overheard between the painter David and Merlin de Thionville, who were talking together about Louis XVI. Would you believe it? Just now he asked me, as I was passing his box, if I would soon have his portrait finished. Bah! And what do you say? That I would never paint the portrait of a tyrant again until I should have his head in my hat. Admirable! I don't know a more sublime answer, even in antiquity. The demands of the revolution grew greater from minute to minute. In the decree of deposition which had been voted on Vergniaud's proposition, it was stipulated that the ministers should continue to exercise their functions. A few instants later, Brissot caused it to be decreed that they had lost the nation's confidence. A new ministry was nominated during the session. The 3 ministers dismissed before June the 20th, Roland, Clavière, and Chevron, were reinstalled by acclamation in the ministries of the Interior, of Finances, and of War. The other ministers were chosen by ballot. Danton was nominated to that of Justice by 282 votes, Monge to the Marine by 150, and Lebrun Tondu to Foreign Affairs by 100. This ballot established the fact that out of 749 members composing the Assembly, but 284 were present. 2 days before, 680 had voted on the question concerning Lafayette, and now at the moment of the final crisis, not more than 284 could be found. All the others had disappeared, through fear or through disgust. The revolution was accomplished by an assembly thus reduced, and a commune whose members had appointed themselves. Marie Antoinette, in her pride as queen, was unable to conceive that there could be anything serious in such a government. When Lebrun Tondu's appointment was announced, she leaned towards Bigot de Sainte-Croix and said in his ear, "I hope you will none the less believe yourself Minister of Foreign Affairs." The unfortunate royal family were still prisoners in the narrow box of the Logograph. The heat there was horrible. The sun scorched the white walls of this furnace where the captives listened, as in a place of torture, to the most ignoble insults and the most sanguinary threats. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Count François de la Rochefoucauld succeeded in approaching the box of the Logograph. He thus describes its aspect at this hour: "I approached the king's box. It was unguarded except by some wretches who were drunk and paid no attention to me, so that I half opened the door. I saw the king with a fatigued and downcast face. He was sitting on the front of the box, coldly observing through his lorgnette the scoundrels who were talking, sometimes one after another, and sometimes all together. Near him was the queen, whose tears and perspiration had completely drenched her fichu and her handkerchief. The Dauphin was asleep on her lap, and resting partly also on that of Madame de Tourzel, Mesdames Elisabeth de Lamballe, and Madame the King's daughter were at the back of the box. I offered my services to the king, who replied that it would be too dangerous to try to see him again, and added that he was going to Luxembourg that evening. The queen asked me for a handkerchief. I had none. Mine had served to bind up the wounds of the Viscount de Maillet, whom I had rescued from some pikemen. I went out to look for a handkerchief, and borrowed one from the keeper of the refreshment room. But as I was taking it to the queen, the sentinels were relieved, and I found it impossible to approach the box." We have just seen what occurred at the Assembly after the close of the combat. Cast now a glance at the Tuileries. What horrible scenes, what cries of grief, how many wounded, dead and dying, what streams of blood. What had become of those Swiss who, either in consequence of their wounds or through some other motive, had been obliged to remain at the palace? 80 of them had defended the grand staircase like heroes against an immense crowd, and died after prodigies of valor. 17 Swiss who were posted in the chapel, and who had not fired a shot since the fight began, hoped to save their lives by laying down their arms. It was a mistake. They had their throats cut like the others. 2 ushers of the king's chamber, Messieurs Paillat and de Marchais, sword in hand and hats pulled down over their eyes, said, "We don't want to live any longer. This is our post. We ought to die here." And they were killed at the door of their master's chamber. Monsieur Dieu died in the same way at the threshold of the queen's bedroom. A certain number of nobles who had not followed the king to the Assembly succeeded in escaping the blows of the assassins. Passing through the suite of large apartments towards the Louvre gallery, they rejoined there some soldiers detailed to guard an opening contrived in the flooring, so as to prevent the assailants from entering by that way. They crossed this opening on boards, and reached the extremity of the gallery unhindered. Then, going down the staircase of Catherine de Medici, they managed to gain the streets near the Louvre. These may have been saved, but woe to all men, no matter what their conditions, who remained in the Tuileries. Domestic servants, ushers, laborers, every soul was put to death. They killed even the dying, even the surgeons who were caring for the wounded. It was Barbaroux himself who described the murderers as cowardly fugitives during the action, assassins after the victory, butchers of dead bodies which they stabbed with their swords so as to give themselves the honors of the combat. In the apartments, on roofs and in cellars, they massacred the Swiss, armed or disarmed, the chevaliers, soldiers, and all who peopled the chateau. Our devotion was of no avail, said Barbaroux again. We were speaking to men who no longer recognized us. And the women, what was their fate? When the firing began, the queen's ladies and the princesses descended to Marie Antoinette's apartments on the ground floor. They closed the shutters, hoping to incur less danger, and lighted a candle so as to not be in total darkness. Then Mademoiselle Pauline de Tourzel exclaimed, "Let us light all the candles in the chandelier, the sconces and the torches. If the brigands force open the door, the astonishment of so many lights will cause them may delay the first blow and give us time to speak." The ladies set to work. When the invaders broke in, sabre in hand, the numberless lights, which were repeated also in the mirrors, made such a contrast with the daylight they had just left that for a moment they remained stupefied. And yet the Princess de Tarente, Madame de la Roche-Aymon, Mademoiselle de Tourzel, Madame de Gineston, and all the other ladies were about to perish when a man with a long beard made his appearance, crying to the assassins in Pétion's name, "Spare the woman, do not dishonor the nation." Madame Campan had attempted to go up a stairway in pursuit of her sister. The murderers followed her. She already felt a terrible hand against her back, trying to seize her by the clothes, when someone cried from the foot of the stairs, "What are you doing up there?" "Hey," said the murderer, in a tone that did not soon leave the trembling woman's ears. The other voice replied, "We don't kill women. The revolution goes fast. It will kill them next year." Madame Campan was on her knees. Her executioner let go his hold. "Get up, hussy," he said to her. "The nation spares you." In going back she walked over corpses. She recognized that of the old Viscount de Broves. The Queen had sent word to him and to another old man, as the last night began, that she desired them to go home. He had replied, "We have been only too obedient to the King's orders in all circumstances, when it was necessary to expose our lives to save him. This time we will not obey, and will simply preserve the memory of the Queen's kindness." What a sight the Tuileries presented, people walking on nothing but dead bodies. A comic actor drank a glass of blood, the blood of a Swiss. One might have thought himself at a feast of Atreus. The furniture was broken, the secretaries forced upon, the mirrors smashed to pieces. Prudhomme, the journalist of the Révolution de Paris, thinks that Medici's Antoinette had too long studied in them the hypocritical look she wears in public. What a sinister carnival! Drunken women and prostitutes put on the Queen's dresses and sprawled on a bed. Through the cellar gratings one can see 1,000 hands groping in the sand and drawing forth bottles of wine. Everywhere people are laughing, drinking, killing. The royal wine runs in streams. Torrents of wine, torrents of blood. The apartments, the staircase, the vestibule are crimson pools. Disfigured corpses, pictures thrust through with pikes, musician stands thrown on the altar, the organ dismounted, broken. That is how the chapel looks. But to rob and murder is not enough. They will kindle a conflagration. It devours the stables of the mounted guards, all the buildings in the courts, the house of the governor of the palace, 1,800 yards of barracks, huts, and houses. Already the fire is gaining on the pavilion of Marchand and the pavilion of Flora. The flames are perceived at the Assembly. A deputy asks to have the firemen sent to fight this fire which threatens the whole quarter Saint-Honoré. Somebody remarks that this is the Commune's business, but the Commune, to use a phrase then in vogue, thinks it has something else to do besides preventing the destruction of the tyrant's palace. It turns a deaf ear. The messenger returns to the Assembly. It is remarked that the flames are doing terrible damage. The President decides to send orders to the firemen, but the firemen return saying, "We can do nothing. They are firing on us. They want to throw us into the fire." What is to be done? The President bethinks himself of a patriot architect, Citizen Payot, who generally makes his appearance whenever there are patriotic demolitions to be accomplished. It is he whom they send to the palace, and who succeeds in getting the flames extinguished. The Tuileries are not burned up this time. The work of the incendiaries of 1792 was only to be finished by the pétroleurs of 1871. Night was come. A great number of the Parisian population were groaning, but the revolutionists triumphed with joy. Curiosity to see the morning battlefield urged the indolent who had stayed at home all day towards the Quai, the Champs-Élysées, and the Tuileries. They looked at the trees under which the Swiss had fallen, at the windows of the apartments where the massacres had taken place, at the ravages made by the hardly extinguished fire. The buildings in the three courts, Court of the Princes, Court Royal, Court of the Swiss, had been completely consumed. Thenceforward these three courts formed only one, separated from the Carrousel by a board partition which remained until 1800, and was replaced by a grating finished on the very day when the first consul came to install himself at the Tuileries. The inscription which was placed above the wooden partition, "On August 10th, royalty was abolished, it will never rise again," disappeared even before the proclamation of the Empire. Squads of laborers gathered up the dead bodies and threw them into tumbrils. At midnight an immense pile was erected on the Carrousel with timbers and furniture from the palace. There the corpses of the victims that had strewed the courts, the vestibule, and the apartments were heaped up and set on fire. The National Guard had disappeared. It figured with the King and the Assembly itself among the vanquished of the day. Instead of its bayonets and uniforms, one saw nothing in the stations and patrols that divided Paris but pikes and tatters. "Someone came to tell me," relates Madame de Staël, "that all of my friends who had been on guard outside the palace had been seized and massacred. I went out at once to learn the news. The coachman who drove me was stopped at the bridge by men who silently made signs that they were murdering on the other side. After 2 hours of useless efforts to pass, I learned that all those in whom I was interested were still living, but that most of them had been obliged to hide in order to escape the proscription with which they were threatened. When I went to see them in the evening, on foot, and in the mean houses where they had been able to find shelter, I found armed men lying before the doors, stupid with drink, and only half waking to utter execrable curses. Several women of the people were in the same state, and their vociferations were more odious still. Whenever a patrol intended to maintain order made its appearance, honest people fled out of its way, for what they called maintaining order was to contribute to the triumph of assassins and rid them of all hindrances. At last the city was going to rest a while after so much emotion. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The assembly, which had been in session for 24 hours, adjourned. Only a few members remained in the hall to maintain the permanence proclaimed at the beginning of the crisis. The inspectors of the hall came for Louis XVI. And his family, to conduct them not to the Luxembourg, but to the upper story of the Convent of the Feuillants, above the corridor where the offices and committees of the Assembly had been established. It was there, in the cells of the monks, that the royal family were to pass the night. Then all was silent once more. Royalty was dying. End of Chapter 31. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 32 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 32. The Royal Family in the Convent of the Feuillants. What a strange prison was this dilapidated old monastery! These little cells, not lived in for 2 years, with their flooring half destroyed, and their narrow windows looking down into courts full of men drunken with wine and blood. By the light of candles stuck into gun barrels, the royal family entered this gloomy lodging, trembling for her son, who was frightened. The queen took him from Monsieur Aubier's arms and whispered to him. The child grew calmer. "Mamma," said he, "has promised to let me sleep in her room, because I was very good before all those wicked men." 4 cells, all opening by similar small doors upon the same corridor, comprised the quarters of the royal family. What a night! The souvenirs of the previous day came back like dismal dreams. Their ears were still deafened with furious cries. They seemed to see the blood of the Swiss flowing like a torrent, the pyramids of corpses in red uniforms, the flames of the terrible conflagration sweeping the approaches to the Tuileries. Marie Antoinette seems under an hallucination. Her emotions break her down. Is this woman, confided to the care of an unknown servant in this deserted old convent, really she? Is this the Queen of France and Navarre? This the daughter of the great Empress Maria Theresa? What uncertainty rests over the fate of her most faithful servitors? What news will she yet learn? Who has fallen? Who has survived the carnage? The hours of the night wear on. Marie Antoinette has not been able to sleep a moment. The Marquis de Tourzel and Monsieur d'Aubier remain at the king's bedside. Before sleeping, he talked to them with the utmost calmness of all that had taken place. "People regret," said he, "that I did not have the rebels attacked before they could have forced the assembly. But besides the fact that in accordance with the terms of the Constitution, the National Guards might have refused to be the aggressors, what would have been the result of this attack? The measures of the insurrection were too well taken for my party to have been victorious, even if I had not left the Tuileries. Do they forget that when the seditious Commune massacred M. Mandat, it rendered his projected defense of no avail?" While Louis XVI was saying this, the men placed under the windows were shouting loudly for the Queen's head. "What has she done to them?" cried the unfortunate sovereign. The next morning, August 11th, several persons were authorized to enter the cells of the convent. Among them was one of the officers of the king's bedchamber, François Hue, who had incurred the greatest dangers on the previous day. Cards of admission were distributed by the inspector of the Assembly Hall. A large guard was stationed at all the issues of the corridor. No one could pass without being stopped and questioned. After surmounting all obstacles, Monsieur Hue reached the cell of Louis XVI. The king was still in bed with his head covered by a coarse cloth. He looked tenderly at his faithful servant, Monsieur U, who could scarcely speak for sobbing. Apprised his unhappy master of the tragic death of several persons whom his Majesty was especially fond of, among them the Chevalier d'Alenville, who had been under governor to the first Dauphin, and several officers of the bedchamber, Messieurs Le Tellier, Payat, and de Marchais. I have at least, said Louis XVI, the consolation of seeing you saved from this massacre. All night long, Madame Elisabeth, the Princess de Lamballe, and Madame de Tourzel had prayed and wept in silence at the door of the chamber where Marie Antoinette watched beside her sleeping children. It was not until morning, after cruel insomnia, that the wretched queen was at last able to close her eyes, and when after a few minutes she opened them again, what an awakening! At 8 o'clock in the morning, Mademoiselle Pauline de Tourzel arrived at the Feuillants. I cannot say enough, she writes in her Souvenir de 41, about the goodness of the king and queen. They asked me many questions about the persons concerning whom I could give them any tidings. Madame and the Dauphin received me with touching signs of affection. They embraced me, and Madame said, "My dear Pauline, do not leave us any more." The courtiers of misfortune came one after another. Madame Campan and her sister Madame Aguillet saw the Prince de Poix, Monsieur d'Aubier, Monsieur de Saint-Pardoux, Madame Elisabeth's equerry, Messieurs de Goguelat, and de Chamilly in the first cell. In the second they found the king. They wanted to kiss his hand, but he prevented it and embraced them without speaking. In the third cell they saw the queen, waiting on by an unknown woman. Marie Antoinette held out her arms. "Come," she cried, "come, unhappy women, come and see one who is still more unhappy than you, since it is she who has been the cause of all your sorrow." She added, "We are ruined. We have reached the place at last to which they have been leading us for 3 years by every possible outrage. We shall succumb in this horrible revolution, and many others will perish after us. Everybody has contributed to our ruin, the innovators like fools, others like the ambitious, in order to aid their own fortunes. For the most furious of the Jacobins want gold and places, and the crowd expected pillage. There is not a patriot in the whole infamous horde. The emigrants had their schemes and manoeuvres. The foreigners wanted to profit by the dissensions of France. Everybody has had a part in our misfortunes." Here the Dauphin entered with his sister and Madame de Tourzel. "Poor children," cried the queen. "How cruel it is not to transmit to them so noble a heritage, and to say, 'All is over for us.'" And as the little Dauphin, seeing his mother and those around her weeping, began to shed tears also. "My child," the queen said, embracing him, "you see I have consolations too. The friends whom misfortune deprived me of were not worth as much as those it gave me." Then Marie Antoinette asked for the queen of the Princess Torrente, Madame de la Roche-Aymon, and others whom she had left at the Tuileries. She compassionated the fate of the victims of the previous day. Madame Campan expressed a desire to know what the foreign ambassadors had done in this catastrophe. The queen replied that they had done nothing, but that the English ambassadress, Lady Sutherland, had just displayed some interest in sending linen for the Dauphin, who was in need of it. What memories must not that little cell in the Feuillants convent have left in the souls of those who were privileged to present there the homage of their devotion to the queen. "I think I still see," Madame Campan had said in her memoirs. "I shall always see that little cell hung with green paper, that wretched couch from which the dethroned sovereign stretched out her arms to us, saying that our woes, of which she was the cause, aggravated her own. There, for the last time, I saw the tears flowing, and heard the sobs of her whose birth and natural gifts, and above all the goodness of whose heart, had destined her to be the ornament of all thrones and the happiness of all peoples." During the 11th and 12th of August, the tortures of the 10th were renewed for the royal family. They were obliged to occupy the odious box of the Logograph during the sessions of the Assembly, and from there witness, as at a show, the slow and painful death struggle of royalty. As she was on her way to this wretched hole, Marie Antoinette perceived in the garden some curious spectators on whose face a certain compassion was depicted. She saluted them. Then a voice cried, "Don't put on so many airs with that graceful head. It is not worth while. You'll not have it much longer." From the box of the Logograph, the royal family listened to the most offensive motions, to decree according to Marseillais a payment of 30 sous a day.
ordered all statues of kings to be overthrown, and petitions demanding the head of all the Swiss who had escaped the massacre. At last the Assembly grew tired of the long humiliation of the august captives. On Monday, August 13th, they were not present at the session, and during the day they were notified that in the evening they were to be incarcerated, not in the Luxembourg, that palace being too good for them, but in the tower of the Temple. When Marie Antoinette was informed of this decision, she turned towards Madame de Tourzel, and putting her hands over her eyes said, "I always asked the Count d'Artois to have that villainous tower of the Temple torn down. It always filled me with horror." Pétion told Louis XVI that the Communal Council had decreed that none of the persons proposed for the service of the royal family should follow them to their new abode. By force of remonstrance, the King finally obtained permission that the Princess de Lamballe, Madame de Tourzel, and her daughter should be excepted from this interdiction, and also Messieurs Hue and de Chamilly and Mesdames Thibault, Bassir, Navarre, and Saint-Brice. The departure for the Temple took place at 5 in the evening. The royal family went in a large carriage with Manuel and Pétion, who kept their hats on. The coachman and footmen, dressed in grey, served their masters for the last time. National Guards escorted the carriage on foot with reversed arms. The passage through a hostile multitude occupied not less than 2 hours. The vehicle, which moved very slowly, stopped for several moments in the Place Vendôme. There Manuel pointed out the statue of Louis XIV, which had been thrown down from its pedestal. At first the descendant of the great king reddened with indignation, then tranquilizing himself instantly, he calmly replied, "It is fortunate, sir, that the rage of the people spends itself on inanimate objects." Manuel might have gone on to say that on this very Place Vendôme, Queen Violette, one of the most furious vixens of the October days, had just been crushed by the fall of this equestrian statue of Louis XIV, to which she was hanging in order to help bring it down. The statue of Henry IV in the Place Royale, that of Louis XIII in the Place des Victoires, and that of Louis XV in the place that bears his name, had fallen at the same time. The royal family arrived at the Temple at 7 in the evening. The lanterns placed on the projection portions of the walls and the battlements of the great tower made it resemble a catafalque surrounded by funeral lights. The Queen wore a shoe with a hole in it, through which her foot could be seen. "You would not believe," said she, smiling, "that a Queen of France was in need of shoes." The doors closed upon the captives, and a sanguinary crowd complained of the thickness of the walls separating them from their prey. End of Chapter 32. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
Chapter 33 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 33. The Temple. There are places which, by the souvenirs they evoke, seem fatal and accursed. Such was the dungeon that was to serve as a prison for Louis XVI and his family. The great tower, for which Marie Antoinette had felt a nameless instinctive repugnance in the happiest days of her reign, arose at the extremity of Paris like a gigantic phantom, and recalled in a sinister fashion the tragedies of the Middle Ages and the sombre legends of the Templars. It was formerly the manor, the fortress, of that religious and military order of the Temple found in the Holy Land at the beginning of the 12th century, to protect pilgrims, and which, after the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, had spread all over Europe. The great tower was built by Frère Hubert in the early years of the 13th century, in the midst of an enclosure surrounded by turreted walls. There ruled by cross and sword those men of iron, in white habits, who took the triple vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and who excited royal jealousy by the increase of their power. It was there that Philippe le Bel went on October 13, 1307, with his lawyers and his archers, to lay his hand on the Grand Master, seize the treasures of the order, and on the same day, at the same hour, cause all Templars to be arrested throughout the realm. Then began that mysterious trial which has remained an insoluble problem to posterity.
and after which these monastic knights, whose bravery and whose exploits have made so prolonged an echo, perished in prisons or on scaffolds. Pursued by horrible accusations, they had confessed under torture, but they denied at execution. When the Grand Master Jacques de Molay and the commander of Normandy were burned alive before the garden of Philippe le Bel, March 11, 1314, even in the midst of flames, they did not cease to attest the innocence of the Order of the Temple. The people, astonished by their heroism, believed that they had summoned the Pope and the King to appear in the presence of God before the end of the year. Clement V on April 20th and Philippe IV on November 29th obeyed the summons. The possession of the order were given to the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, who transformed themselves into Knights of Malta toward the middle of the 16th century. The temple became the provincial house of the Grand Prior of the Order of Malta for the nation or language of France, and the great tower contained successively the treasure, the arsenal, and the archives. In 1607, the Grand Prior, Jacques de Souvré, had a house built in front of the old manor between the court and the garden, which was called the Palace of the Grand Prior. His successor, Philippe de Vendôme, made his palace a rendezvous of elegance and pleasure. There shone the Anacreon in a cassock, the gay and sprightly Abbé de Chaulieu, who died a fervent Christian in the voluptuous abode where he had dwelt a careless Epicurean. There young Voltaire went to complete the lessons he had begun in the sceptical circle of Ninon de l'Enclos. The office of the Grand Prior, which was worth 60,000 livres a year, passed afterwards to Prince de Conti, who in 1765 sheltered Jean-Jacques Rousseau there, as Lettres de Cachet could not penetrate with its privileged precinct. Under Louis XVI, the palace of the Grand Prior had served as a passing hostelry to the young and brilliant Count d'Artois when he came from Versailles to Paris. The flowers of the entertainments given there by the prince were hardly faded when Louis XVI suddenly entered it as a prisoner. It was 7 o'clock in the evening when the wretched king and his family, coming from the convent of the Feuillants, arrived at the temple. Situated near Faubourg Saint-Antoine, not far from the former site of the Bastille, the temple enclosure at this period was not more than 200 yards long by nearly as many wide. The rest of the ancient precinct had disappeared under the pavements or the houses of the great city. Nevertheless, the enclosure still formed a sort of little private city, sometimes called the Ville Neuve du Temple, the gates of which were closed every night. In one of its angles stood the house called the Grand Prior's Palace. This was the first stopping place of the royal family, which had been entrusted by Pétion to the surveillance of the municipality and the guard of Santerre. The municipal officers stayed close to the king, kept their hats on, and gave him no title except Monsieur. Louis XVI, not doubting that the palace of the Grand Prior was a residence assigned him by the nation until the close of his career, began to visit its apartments. While the municipal officers took a cruel pleasure in this error, thinking of the still keener one they would enjoy when they disabused him of it, he pleased himself by allotting the different rooms in advance. The word palace had an unpleasant sound to the persecutors of royalty. The temple tower looked more like a prison. Toward 11 o'clock, one of the commissioners ordered the august captives to collect such linen and other clothing as they had been able to procure, and follow him. They silently obeyed and left the palace. The night was very dark. They passed through a double row of soldiers holding naked sabres. The municipal officers carried lanterns. One of them broke the dismal silence he had observed throughout the march. "Thy master," said he to Monsieur U, "has been accustomed to gilded canopies. Very well, he is going to find out how we lodged the assassins of the people." The lamps in the windows of the old quadrangular dungeon lighted up its high pinnacles and turrets, its gigantic profile and gloomy bulk. The immense tower, 150 feet high, and with walls 9 feet thick, rose menacing and fatal amidst the darkness. Beside it was another tower, narrower and not so high, but which was also flanked by turrets. Thus the whole dungeon was composed of 2 distinct yet united towers. The second of these, called the Little Tower, to distinguish it from the great one, was selected as the prison of the former hosts of Versailles, Fontainebleau, and the Tuileries. The Little Tower of the Temple, which had no interior communication with the great one against which it stood, was a long quadrangle flanked by 2 turrets. 4 steps led to the door, which was low and narrow, and opened on a landing at the end of which began a winding staircase shaped like a snail shell. Wide from its base as far as the first story, it grew narrower as it climbed up into the second. The door, which was considered too weak, was to be strengthened on the following day by heavy bars, and supplied with an enormous lock brought from the prisons of the Châtelet. The Queen was put on the second floor, and the King on the third. On entering his chamber, Louis XVI found a miserable bed in an alcove without tapestry or curtains. He showed neither ill humour nor surprise. Engravings, indecent for the most part, covered the walls. He took them down himself. "I will not leave such objects before my children's eyes," said he. Then he lay down and slept tranquilly. The first days of captivity were relatively calm. The prisoners consoled themselves by their family life, reading, and above all, prayer. Forgetting that he had been a king, and remembering that he was a father, Louis XVI gave lessons to the Dauphin. It would have been worthwhile for the whole nation to be present at these lessons. They would have been both surprised and touched at all the sensible, cordial, and kindly things the good King found to say when the map of France lay spread out before him, or concerning the chronology of his predecessors. Everything in his remarks showed the love he bore his subjects, and how greatly his paternal heart desired their happiness. What great and useful lessons one could learn in listening to this captive king, instructing a child born to the throne and condemned to share the captivity of his parents. Souvenir des 40 ans by Madame de Béarn, née de Tourzel. All those who had been authorized to follow the royal family to the temple, the Princess de Lamballe, Madame de Tourzel, and her daughters Mesdames Thibault, Barsir, Navarre, Messieurs de Chamilly and François Hue, surrounded the captives with the most respectful and devoted attentions. But these noble courtiers of misfortune, these voluntary prisoners, who were so glad to be associated in their master's trials, were not long to enjoy an honor they had so keenly desired. In the night of August the 18th to the 19th, 2 municipal officers presented themselves, who were commissioned to fetch away all persons not belonging to the Capet family. The Queen pointed out in vain that the Princess de Lamballe was a relative. The princess must go with the others. "In our position," has said Madame de Tourzel, the governess of the children of France, "there was nothing to do but obey. We dressed ourselves and went to the Queen, to whom I resigned that dear little prince, whose bed had been carried into her room without awaking him." It was an indescribable torture for Madame de Tourzel to abandon the Dauphin, whom she cherished so tenderly, and whom she had educated since 1789. "I abstained from looking at him," she adds, "not only to avoid weakening the courage we had so much need of, but in order to give no room for censure, and so come back, if possible, to a place we left with so much regret." The Queen went instantly into the chamber of the Princess de Lamballe, from whom she parted with the utmost grief. To Pauline and me she showed a touching sensibility, and said to me in an undertone, "If we are not so happy as to see you again, take good care of Madame de Lamballe. Do the talking on all important occasions, and spare her as much as possible from having to answer captious and embarrassing questions." The 2 municipal officers said to Hue and Chamilly, "Are you the valet de chambre?" On their affirmative response, the 2 faithful servants were ordered to get up and prepare for departure. They shook hands with each other, both of them convinced that they had reached the end of their existence. One of the municipal officers had said that very day in their presence, "The guillotine is permanent, and strikes with death the pretended servants of Louis." When they descended to the Queen's antechamber, a very small room in which the Princess de Lamballe slept, they found that Princess and Madame de Tourzel all ready to start, and clasped in one embrace with the Queen, the children, and Madame Elisabeth. Tender and heartbreaking farewells, presages of separations more cruel still. All these exiles from the prison left at the same time. Only one of them, Monsieur François Hue, was to return. He was examined at the Hôtel de Ville, and at the close of this interrogation an order was signed permitting him to be taken back to the Tower. "How happy I was," he writes, "to return to the temple. I ran to the King's chamber. He was already up and dressed, and was reading as usual in the little tower. The moment he saw me, his anxiety to know what had occurred made him advance toward me, but the presence of the municipal officers and the guards who were near him made all conversation impossible. I indicated by a glance that for the moment prudence forbade me to explain myself. Feeling the necessity of silence as well as myself, the King resumed his reading and waited for a more opportune moment. Some hours later, I hastily informed him what questions had been asked me and what I had replied. Dernière année de Louis XVI, par François Hue. The unfortunate sovereign doubtless believed that the others were also about to return. Vain hope. During the day, Manuel announced to the king that none of them would come back to the temple. "What has become of them?" asked Louis XVI anxiously. "They are prisoners of the force," returned Manuel. "What are they going to do with the only servant I have left?" asked the king, glancing at Monsieur Hue. "The Commune leaves him with you," said Manuel. "But as he cannot do everything, men will be sent to assist him." "I do not want them," replied Louis XVI. "What he cannot do, we will do ourselves. Please God, we will not voluntarily give those who have been taken from us the chagrin of seeing their places taken by others." In Manuel's presence, the Queen and Madame Elisabeth aided Monsieur Hue to prepare the things most necessary for the new prisoners of the force. The two princesses arranged the packets of linen and other matters with the skill and activity of chambermaids. Behold the heir of Louis XIV, the King of France and Navarre, with but a single servant left him. He has but one coat, and at night his sister mends it. Behold the daughter of the German Caesars, with not even one woman to wait upon her, and who waits on herself, incessantly watched, meanwhile, by the inquisitors of the Commune, who cannot speak a word or make a gesture unwitnessed by a squad of informers who pursue her even into the chamber where she goes to change her dress, and who spy on her even when she is sleeping. And yet neither the calmness nor the dignity of the prisoners suffers any loss. There was but one thing that keenly annoyed Louis XVI. It was when, on August the 24th, they deprived him, the chief of gentlemen, of his sword, as if taking away his sceptre were not enough. He consoled himself by prayer, meditation, and reading. He spent hours in the room containing the library of the keeper of archives of the Order of Malta, who had previously occupied the little tower. One day, when he was looking for books, he pointed out to Monsieur Hue the works of Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. "Those two men have ruined France," said he in an undertone. On another day he was pained by overhearing the insults heaped on this faithful servant by one of the municipal guards. "You have had a great deal to suffer today," he said to him. "Well, for the love of me, continue to endure everything. Make no answer." At another time he slipped into his hand a folded paper. "This is some of my hair," said he. "It is the only present I can give you at this moment." Monsieur Hue exclaims in his pathetic book, "O shade forever cherished, I will preserve this precious gift to my latest day. The inheritance of my son, it will pass on to my descendants, and all of them will see this testimonial of Louis XVI's goodness, that they had a father who merited the affection of his king by his fidelity." In the evenings the Queen made the Dauphin recite this prayer: "Almighty God, who created and redeemed me, I adore thee. Spare the lives of the king, my father, and those of my family. Defend us against our enemies. Grant Madame de Tourzel the strength she needs to support the evils she endures on our account." And the angel of the temple, Madame Elisabeth, recited every day this sublime prayer of her own composition: "What will happen to me today, O my God? I do not know. All I know is that nothing will happen that has not been foreseen by thee from all eternity. It is enough, my God, to keep me tranquil. I adore thy eternal designs. I submit to them with my whole heart. I will all, I accept all, I sacrifice all to thee. I unite this sacrifice to that of thy dear Son, my Saviour, asking thee by his sacred heart and his infinite merits, the patience in our afflictions, and the perfect submission which is due to thee for all that thou williest and permittest." One day, when she had finished her prayer, the saintly princess said to Monsieur Hue, "It is less for the unhappy king than for his misguided people that I pray. May the Lord deign to be moved and to look mercifully upon France." Then she added with her admirable resignation, "Come, let us take courage. God will never send us more troubles than we are able to bear." The prisoners were permitted to walk a few steps in the garden every day to get a breath of fresh air, but even there they were insulted. As they passed by, the guards stationed at the base of the tower took pains to put on their hats and sit down. The sentries scrawled insults on the walls. Colporteurs maliciously cried out bad tidings, which were sometimes false. One day one of them announced a pretended decree separating the king from his family. The Queen, who was near enough to hear distinctly the voice which told this news, not exact as yet, was struck with a terror from which she did not recover. And yet there were still souls that gave way to compassion. From the upper stories of houses near the temple enclosure, there were eyes looking down into the garden where the prisoners took their walk. The common people and the workmen living in these poor abodes were affected. Sometimes, to show her gratitude for the sympathy of those unknown friends, Marie Antoinette would remove her veil and smile. When the little Dauphin was playing, there would be hands at the windows joined as if to applaud. Flowers would sometimes fall, as if by chance, from a garret roof to the Queen's feet, and occasionally it happened that when the captives had gone back to their prison, they could hear in the darkness the echo of some royalist refrain, hummed by a passer-by in the silence of the night. The Temple Tower is no longer in existence. Bonaparte visited it when he was consul. "There are too many souvenirs in that prison," he exclaimed. "I will tear it down." In 1811 he kept his promise. The palace of the Grand Prior was destroyed in 1853. No trace remains of that famous enclosure of the Templars, whose legend has no sombre poetry, but it has left an impress on the imagination of peoples which will never be effaced. It seems to rise again gigantic, that tower where the son of St. Louis realized not only the type of the antique sage of whom Horace said, "Impivadum ferient ruinae," but also the purest ideal of the true Christian. Does not the name Temple seem predestined for a spot which was to be sanctified by so many virtues, and where the martyr king put in practice these verses of the Imitation of Jesus Christ, his favorite book? It needs no great virtue to live peaceably with those who are upright and amiable. One is naturally pleased in such society. We always love those whose sentiments agree with ours. But it is very praiseworthy, and the effect of a special grace and great courage, to live in peace with severe and wicked men who are disorderly or who contradict us. He who knows best how to suffer will enjoy the greatest peace. Such a one is the conqueror of himself, master of the world, the friend of Jesus Christ, and the inheritor of heaven. End of chapter 33. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 34 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 34. The Princess de Lamballe's Murder. The Princess de Lamballe, after being taken from the Temple in the night of August 18th to the 19th, had been examined by Biot Varenne at the Hôtel de Ville, and then sent at noon August 19th to the Force. This prison, divided into two distinct parts, the Great and the Little Force, was situated between the rues Roi de Sicile, Culture, and Pavé. In 1792 it supplemented the Abbey and Châtelet prisons, which were overcrowded. The Little Force had a separate entry on the Rue Pavé to the Marais, while the door of the large one opened on the Rue des Bayets, a few steps from the Rue Saint-Antoine. The register of the Little Force, which is preserved in the archives of the Prefecture of Police, records that, at the time of the September Massacres, this prison, in which the Princess de Lamballe was immured, contained 110 women, most of them not concerned with political affairs, and in great part women of the town. Here, from August 19th to September 3rd, the princess suffered inexpressible anguish. She never heard a turnkey open the door of her cell without thinking that her last hour had come. The massacres began on September 2nd. On that day, the Princess de Lamballe was spared. In the evening she threw herself on her bed, a prey to the most cruel anxiety. Towards 6 o'clock the next morning, the turnkey entered with a frightened air. "They are coming here," he said to the prisoners. 6 men, armed with sabres, guns, and pistols, followed him, approached the beds, and asked the names of the women, and went out again. Madame de Tourzel, who shared the Princess de Lamballe's captivity, said to her, "This threatens to be a terrible day, dear princess. We know not what heaven intends for us. We must ask God to forgive our faults. Let us say the Miserere and the Confiteor as acts of contrition, and recommend ourselves to his goodness. The two women said their prayers aloud, and incited each other to resignation and courage. There was a window which opened on the street, and from which, although it was very high, one could see what was passing by mounting on Madame de Lamballe's bed, and thence to the window ledge. The princess climbed up, and as soon as her head was noticed on the street, a pretence of firing on her was made. She saw a considerable crowd at the prison door. Very little doubt remained concerning her fate. Neither she nor Madame de Tourzel had eaten since the previous day, but they were too greatly moved to take any breakfast. They dared not speak to each other. They took their work and sat down to await the result of the fatal day in silence. Toward 11 o'clock the door opened. Armed men filled the room and demanded Madame de Lamballe. The princess put on a gown, bade adieu to Madame de Tourzel, and was led to the great force, where some municipal officers, wearing their insignia, subjected the prisoners to a pretended trial. In front of this tribunal stood executioners with ferocious faces, who brandished bloody weapons. The atmosphere was sickening, full of the steam of carnage and the odors of wine and blood. Madame de Lamballe fainted. When she recovered consciousness, she was interrogated. "Who are you?" "Marie-Louise, Princess of Savoy." "What is your rank?" "Superintendent of the Queen's household." "Were you acquainted with the conspiracies of the court on August 10th? "I do not know that there were any conspiracies on August 10th, but I know I had no knowledge of them." "Swear liberty, equality, hatred to the King, the Queen, and royalty." "I will swear the first two without difficulty. I cannot swear the last, it is not in my heart." Here an assistant said in a whisper to Madame de Lamballe, "Swear it. If you do not swear, you are a dead woman." The princess made no answer. She put her hands up to her eyes, covered her face with them, and made a step toward the wicket. The judge exclaimed, "Let someone release Madame." This phrase was the death signal. Two men took the victim roughly by the arms and made her walk over corpses. Hardly had she crossed the threshold when she received a blow from a sabre on the back of her head, which made her blood flow in streams. In the narrow passage leading from the Rue Saint-Antoine to the Force, and called the Priest's cul-de-sac, she was dispatched with pikes on a heap of dead bodies. Then they stripped off her clothes and exposed her body to the insults of a horde of cannibals. When the blood had flowed from her wounds, or that of the neighboring corpses had soiled the body too much, they washed it with a sponge so that the crowd might notice its whiteness better. They cut off her head and her breasts. They tore her heart out, and of this head and this heart they made horrible trophies. The pikes which bore them were lifted high in air, and they went to carry around these excellent spoils of the Revolution. At the very moment when the hideous procession began its march, Madame de Lebel, the wife of a painter who owed many benefits to Madame de Lamballe, was trying to get near the prison, hoping to hear news of her. Seeing the great commotion in the crowd, she inquired the cause. When someone replied, "It is Lamballe's head that they are going to carry through Paris," she was seized with horror, and, turning back, took refuge in a hairdresser's shop on the Place Bastille. Hardly had she done so, when the crowd entered the Place. The murderers came into the shop and required the hairdresser to arrange the head of the princess. They washed it, and powdered the fair hair, all soiled with blood. Then one of the assassins cried joyfully, "Now, at any rate, Antoinette can recognize her." The procession resumed its march. From time to time they called a halt before a wine shop. Wishing to empty his glass, the scoundrel who had the princess's head in his hand set it flat down on the lead counter. Then it was put back on the end of a pike. The heart was on another pike, and other individuals dragged along the headless corpse. In this manner they arrived in front of the Temple. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. On that day the royal family had been refused permission to go into the garden. They were in the little tower when the cries of the multitude became audible. The workmen who were then employed in tearing down the walls and buildings contiguous to the Temple dungeon mingled with the crowd, increased also by innumerable curious spectators, and uttered furious shouts. One of the municipal guards at the Temple closed doors and windows, and pulled down curtains so that the captives could see nothing. On the street in front of the enclosure, a tricolored ribbon had been fastened across, with this inscription: "Citizens, you who know how to ally the love of order with a just vengeance, respect this barrier. It is necessary to our surveillance and our responsibility." This was the sole dike they meant to oppose to the torrent. At the side of this ribbon stood a municipal officer named Danjou, formerly a priest, who was called Abbé 6 feet on account of his height. He mounted on a chair and harangued the crowd. He felt his face touched by Madame de Lamballe's head, still on the end of a pike, which the bearer shook about and gesticulated with, and also by a rag of a chemise soaked with blood and mire, which another individual also carried on a pike. The naked body was there likewise, with its back to the ground and the front cut open to the breast. Danjou tried to make the crowd of assassins who wanted to invade the temple understand that at a moment when the enemy was master of the frontiers, it would be impolitic to deprive themselves of hostages so precious as Louis XVI and his family. Moreover, he added, would it not demonstrate their innocence if you dare not try them? How much worthier it is of a great people to execute a king guilty of treason on the scaffold. Thus, while preventing an immediate massacre, he held the scaffold in reserve. Danjou said that the communal council, in order to show its confidence in the citizens composing the mob, had decided that 6 of them should be admitted to make the rounds of the temple garden with the commissioners at their head. The ribbon was then raised and several persons entered the enclosure. There were those who carried the remains of Madame de Lamballe. With these were the labourers who had been at work on the demolitions. Voices were heard demanding furiously that Marie Antoinette should show herself at a window, so that some might climb up and make her kiss her friend's head. As Danjou opposed this infernal scheme, he was accused of being on the side of the tyrant. Was the dungeon of the temple to be forced? Were the assassins about to seize the queen, tear her in pieces and drag her like a friend through the streets and squares to the rolling of drums and the chanting of the Marseillaise and the Ça ira? The municipal officer entered the tower and began a mysterious parley with his colleagues. As Louis XVI asked what was going on, someone replied, "Well, sir, since you desire to know, they want to show you Madame de Lamballe's head." Meanwhile, the cries outside were growing louder. Another municipal came in, followed by 4 delegates from the mob. One of them, who carried a heavy sabre in his hand, insisted that the prisoners should present themselves at the window, but this was opposed by the municipal officers, who were less cruel. This man said to the queen in an insulting tone, "They want us to hide the Princess de Lamballe's head from you when we brought it to let you see how the people avenge themselves on their tyrants. I advise you to show yourself if you don't want the people to come up." Marie Antoinette fainted on learning her friend's death in this manner. Her children burst into tears and tried by their caresses to bring her back to consciousness. The man did not go away. "Sir," the king said to him, "we are prepared for the worst, but you might have dispensed yourself from informing the queen of this frightful calamity." Cléry, the king's valet, was looking through a corner of the window blinds and saw Madame de Lamballe's head. The person carrying it had climbed up on a heap of rubbish from the buildings in process of demolition. Another who stood beside him held her bleeding heart. Cléry heard Danjou expostulating the crowd in words like these: "Antoinette's head does not belong to you. The departments have their rights in it also. France has confided these great criminals to the care of Paris, and it is your business to assist us in guarding them until national justice shall avenge the people." Then, addressing himself to these cannibals as if they were heroes whose courage and exploits he praised, he added, in speaking of the profound corpse of the Princess de Lamballe, "The remains you have there are the property of all. Do they not belong to all Paris? Have you the right to deprive others of the pleasure of sharing your triumph? Night will soon be here. Make haste, then, to quit this precinct, which is too narrow for your glory. You ought to place this trophy in the Palais Royal or the Tuileries garden, where the sovereignty of the people has been so often trampled underfoot, as an eternal monument of the victory you have just won." Remarks like these were all that could prevent these tigers from entering the temple and destroying the prisoners. Shouts of "To the Palais Royal" proved to Danjou that his harangue had been appreciated. The assassins at last departed, after having covered his face with kisses that smelt of wine and blood. They wanted to show their victim's head at the Hôtel Toulouse, the mansion of the venerable Duc de Penthièvre, her father-in-law, but were deterred by the assurance that she did not ordinarily live there, but at the Tuileries. Then they turned toward the Palais Royal. The Duke of Orleans was at a window with his mistress, Madame de Buffon. He left it, but he may have seen the head of his sister-in-law. Some of the cannibals had remained in the neighborhood of the temple. Sitting down at table in a wine shop, they had the heart of the Princess de Lamballe cooked and ate it with avidity. Thus says M. de Beauchesne in his excellent work on Louis XVII. This civilization, which had departed from God, surpassed at a single bound the fury of savages, and the 18th century, so proud of its learning and humanity, ended by anthropophagy. In the evening, when someone was giving the Colo des Bois an account of the day's performances, he expressed but one regret, that they had not succeeded in showing Marie Antoinette the remains of the Princess de Lamballe. What, he spitefully exclaimed, did they spare the Queen that impression? They ought to have served up her best friend's head in a covered dish at her table. End of Section 34. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 35 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Humbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 35. The September Massacres. Lovers of paradoxes have tried to represent the September Massacres as something spontaneous, a passing delirium of opinion, a sort of great national convulsion. This myth was a lie against history and humanity. It exists no longer, heaven be thanked. The myths with which it was sought to shroud these execrable crimes are now dissipated. Light has been shed upon that series of infernal spectacles which would have made cannibals blush. No, these odious massacres were not the result of a popular movement, an unforeseen fanaticism, a paroxysm of rage or vengeance. They present an ensemble of murders committed in cool blood, a planned and premeditated thing. M. Mortimer Ternaux, in his Histoire de la Terreur, M. Grenier de Cassagnac, in his Histoire des Girondins et des Massacres de Septembre, have proved this abundantly. They have exhumed from the archives and the record offices such a mass of uncontested and incontestable documents that not the slightest doubt is now permissible. Edgar Quinet, who had hesitated to recognize this in his book La Révolution, he says, the massacres were executed administratively. The same discipline was everywhere displayed throughout the carnage. This was not a piece of blind, spontaneous barbarism. It was a barbarity slowly mediated, minutely elaborated by a sanguinary mind. Hence it bears no resemblance to anything previously known in history. Marat harvested in September what he had been sowing for years. The Parisian populace, 800,000 souls, was inert. It was cowardly. It trembled. But it did not approve. It was not an accomplice. It was a monstrous thing that a handful of cutthroats should be enough to transform Paris into a slaughterhouse. One shudders in thinking what a few criminals can accomplish in the midst of an immense population. The people, the real people, that composed of laborious and honest workmen, ardent and patriotic at heart, and of young bourgeois with generous aspirations and indomitable courage, never united for an instant with the scoundrels recruited by Maillard from every kennel in the capital. While the hired assassins of the Committee of Surveillance established in the prisons what Vergniaud called a butcher's shop for human flesh, the true populace was assembled on the Champ de Mars and before the enlistment booths. It was offering its purest blood for the country. It would have blushed to shed that of helpless unfortunates. In 1871, the murder of hostages and the burning of monuments was no more approved by the population than the massacres in the prisons were in 1792. The crimes were committed at both epochs by a mere handful of individuals. The great majority of the people were guilty merely of apathy and fear. The hideous tableau surpasses the most lugubrious conceptions of Dante's somber imagination. Paris is a hell. From August 29th, it is like a torpid oriental town. The whole city is in custody, like a criminal whose limbs are held while he is being searched and put in irons. Every house is inspected by the agents of the Commune. A knock at the door makes the inmates tremble. The denunciation of an enemy, a servant, a neighbor, is a death sentence. People scarcely dare to breathe. Neither running water nor solid earth is free. The parapets of quays, the arches of bridges, the bathing and washing boats are bristling with sentries. Everything is surrounded. There is no refuge. 3,000 suspected persons are taken out of houses and crowded into prisons. The hunt begins anew the following day. The program of massacres is arranged. The Communal Council of Surveillance has minutely regulated everything. The price of the actual work is settled. The personnel of cutthroats is at its post. Danton has furnished the executioners, Manuel the victims. All is ready. The bloody drama can begin. On September 2nd, Danton said to the Assembly, The tocsin about to sound is not an alarm signal. It is a charge upon the enemies of the country. To vanquish them, gentlemen, all that is needed is boldness, and again boldness, and always boldness. 2 days before he had been still more explicit. The 10th of August, said he, divided us into Republicans and Royalists, the first few in number, the second many. We must make the Royalists afraid. A frightful gesture, a horizontal gesture, sufficed to express his meaning. Robbery preceded murder. It was a veritable raid. The Commune caused the palaces, national property, le garde meuble, the houses and mansions of the émigrés to be pillaged. One saw nothing but carts and wagons transporting stolen goods to the Hôtel de Ville. All the plate was stolen from the churches likewise. Millions, says Madame Roland in her memoirs, passed into the hands of people who used it to perpetuate the anarchy which was the source of their domination. When will the men of the Commune render their accounts? Never. Who are the accomplices of Danton and Marat in organizing the massacres? A band of defaulting accountants, faithless violators of public trusts, breakers of locks, swindlers, spies, and men overwhelmed with debts. What interest have they in planning the murders? That of perpetuating the dictatorship they had assumed on the eve of August 10th, and above all, of having no accounts to render. A few weeks later on, Collot d'Herbois will say at the Jacobin Club, the 2nd of September is the chief article in the creed of our liberty. The jailers were forewarned. They served the prisoners dinner earlier, and took away their knives. There was a disturbed and uneasy look in their faces, which made the victims suspect their end was near. Toward noon the general alarm was beaten in every street. The citizens were ordered to return at once to their dwellings. An order was issued to illuminate every house when night fell. The shops were closed. Terror overspread the entire city. It was agreed that at the third discharge of cannon the cutthroats should set to work. The first blood shed was that of prisoners taken from the mayoralty of the Abbey prison. The carriages containing them passed along the Quai des Orfèvres, the Pont-Neuf and Rue Dauphine, until it reached the Bussy Square. Here there was a crowd assembled around a platform where enlistments were going on. The throng impeded the progress of the carriage. Thereupon one of the escort opened the door of one of them, and standing on the step plunged his sabre into the breast of an aged priest. The multitude shuddered and fled in affright. "That makes you afraid," said the assassin. "You will see plenty more like it." The rest of the escort followed the example set them. The carriages go on again, and so do the massacres. They kill along the route, and they kill on arriving at the Abbey. Towards 5 o'clock, Billaud-Varennes presents himself there, wearing his municipal scarf. "People," says he, "what he calls people is a band of salaried assassins. People, thou immolatest thine enemies, thou art doing thy duty." Then he walks into the midst of the dead bodies, dipping his feet in blood, and fraternizes with the murderers. "There is nothing more to do here," explains Maillard. "Let us go to the Carmelites." At the Carmelites, 180 priests, crowded into the church and convent, were awaiting their fate with pious resignation. 2 days before, Manuel had said to them ironically, "In 48 hours you will all be free. Get ready to go into a foreign country and enjoy the repose you cannot find here." And on the previous day, a gendarme said to the Archbishop of Arles, blowing the smoke from his pipe into his face as he did so, "It is tomorrow, then, that they are going to kill your grandeur." A short time before the massacre began, the victims were sent into the garden. At the bottom of it was an orangery which had since become a chapel. Monsieur Dulot, Archbishop of Arles, and the Bishops of Beauvais and de Saint, both of whom were named de la Rochefoucauld, kneeled down with the other priests and recited the last prayers. The murderers approached. The Archbishop of Arles, who was upwards of 80, advanced to meet them. "I am he whom you seek," he said. "My sacrifice is made. But spare these worthy priests, they will pray for you on earth as I in heaven." They insulted him before they struck him. "I have never done harm to anyone," said he. An assassin responded, "Very well, I'll do some to you," and killed him. The other priests were chased around the garden from one tree to another and shot down. During this infernal hunt, the murderers were shouting with laughter and singing their favorite song, Dansez la Carmagnole. The massacres of the Carmelites is over. "Let us go back to the Abbey," cries Maillard. "We shall find more game there. This time there is a pretense of justice made. The tribunal is the vestibule of the Abbey. Maillard, the chief cutthroat, is president. The assassins are the judges, and the public the Marseillais, the sans-culottes, the female furies, and men to whom murder was a delightful spectacle. The prisoners are summoned one after another. They enter the vestibule, which has a wicket as a door of exit. They are questioned simply as a matter of form. Their answers are not even listened to. "Conduct this gentleman to the force," says the president. The prisoners think he is safe. He does not know that this phrase has been agreed upon as a signal of death. On reaching the wicket, the hatchet and saber strokes cut him down in the midst of his dream. The Swiss officers and the soldiers who had survived August 10th were murdered thus. Their torture lasted a longer or shorter time, and was accomplished with more or less cruel refinements according to the caprice of the assassins, who were nearly all drunk. Night came and torches were lighted. No shadows, a grand illumination. They must see clear in the slaughterhouse. Lanterns were placed near the lakes of blood and heaps of dead bodies, so as plainly to distinguish the work from the workmen. There were some who were bent on losing no details of the carnage. The spectators wanted to take things easy. They were tired of standing too long. Benches for men and others for dames were got ready for them. The death rattle of the agonizing, the vociferations of the assassins, the emulation between the executioners who kill slowly and the victims who are in a haste to die give joy to the spectators. There is no interruption to the human butchery. There has been so much blood spilled that the feet of the murderers slip on the pavement. A litter is made of straw and the clothes of the victims, and thereafter none are killed except upon this mattress. In this way, the work is more commodiously accomplished. The assassins have plenty of assurance. Morning dawns on the continuation of the murders, and the wives of the murderers bring them something to eat. On September 2nd, the only persons handed over to the cutthroats were at the Abbey, the Carmelites and Saint-Firmin. On September 3rd, the massacre became more general. The assassins had said, "If there is no more work, we shall have to find some." Their desire realizes itself. Work will not be lacking. There is still some at the force, where the Princess de Lamballe, the preferred victim, is murdered. The assassins, who at the Abbey had been paid at the rate of 8 francs a day, get only 50 sous at the force. They work with undiminished zeal, even at this reduction. If necessary, they would work for nothing. To drink wine and shed blood is the essential thing. The Negro Delorme, servant to Fournier, the American, distinguishes himself among them all. His black skin reddened with blood, his white teeth and ferocious eyes, his bestial laugh, his ravenous fury, make him a choice assassin. There is work too at the Conciergerie, where the great and little Châtelet, the Salpêtrière and the Bicêtre. A great number of those detained are people condemned or accused of private crimes, which had absolutely nothing to do with politics. No matter, blood is wanted, they kill there as elsewhere. At the Grand Châtelet, work is so plenty and the assassins so few, that they release several individuals imprisoned for theft and impress them into their service. One of these unfortunate accidental executioners begins in a hesitating way, strikes a few undecided blows, and then throws down the hatchet placed in his hand. "No, no," he cries, "I cannot. No, no, rather a victim than a murderer. I would rather receive death from scoundrels like you than give it to innocent, disarmed people. Strike me." And at once the veteran murderers kill the inexperienced cutthroat. There was a woman, known on account of her charms as a beautiful flower girl, who was accused of having wounded her lover, a French guard, in a fit of jealousy. Théroigne de Méricourt, an Amazon of the gutters, was her rival. She pointed her out to the assassins. They fastened her naked to a post, her legs spread apart and her feet nailed to the ground. They burned her alive. They cut off her breasts with saber strokes. They impaled her on a hot iron. Her shrieks carried dismay as far as the outer banks of the Seine. Théroigne was at the height of felicity. At the Salpêtrière there was still another spectacle. This prison for fallen women is a place of correction for the old, of amendment for the young, and an asylum for those who are still children. More than 40 children of the lower classes were slain during these horrible days. The delirium of murder reached its height. Gorged with wine mingled with gunpowder, intoxicated with the fumes and reek of carnage, the assassins experienced a devouring, inextinguishable thirst for blood which nothing could quench. More blood, and yet more blood. And where can it now be found? The prisons are empty. There are no more nobles, no more priests to put to death. Very well. For lack of anything better, they will go to an asylum for the poor, the sick, and the insane, to the Bicêtre. Vagabonds, paupers, fools, thieves, steward, chaplains, janitor, all is fish that comes to their net. The butchery lasts 5 days and nights without stopping. Massacre takes every form. Some are drowned in the cellars, others shot in the courts, water, fire, and sword, every sort of torture. The cutthroats at last take some repose. They have worked all the week. There are still some, however, who have not yet had enough. and who are going to continue the massacres of Paris in the provinces. The Communal Council of Surveillance has taken care to send to every commune in France a circular bearing the seal of the Minister of Justice, inviting them to follow the example of the capital. September 9th, the prisoners who had been detained at Orleans to be tried there by the Superior Court entered Versailles on carts. At the moment when they approached the grating of the Orangerie, assassins sent from Paris under the lead of Fournier, the American, sprang upon them and immolated every one. Thus perished the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, de Lessart, and the Duc de Brissac, former commander of the Constitutional Guard. Fournier, the American, returned on horseback to Paris and began to caracole on the Place Vendôme. Danton loudly felicitated him on the success of the expedition from the balcony of the Ministry of Justice. During all this time, what efforts had the Assembly made to put a stop to the murders? None, absolutely none. Never had any deliberative body shown a like cowardice. Neither Vergniaud's voice nor that of any other Girondin was heard in protest. Indignation, pity, found not a single word to say. Speeches, discussions, votes on different questions went on as usual. Concerning the massacres, not a syllable. During that infamous week, neither the ministers, the virtuous Roland, not more than the others, neither Pétion, the mayor of Paris, nor the commander of the National Guard sent a picket guard of 50 men to any quarter to prevent the murders. A population of 800,000 souls and a National Guard of 50,000 men bent their necks under a yoke of a handful of bandits, of 235 assassins. The exact number is known. People trembled. At the Assembly, the old moderate party had disappeared. There were not more than 200 odd deputies present at the shameful and powerless sessions. Terrorized Paris was in a state of stupor and prostration. The murderers ended by execrating themselves. Tormented by remorse, they could see nothing before them but vivid faces, reeking entrails, bleeding limbs. Among the cutthroats, M. Louis Blanc has said, some gave signs of insanity and led to the supposition that some mysterious and terrible drug had been mingled with the wine they drank. Some of them became furious madmen. Others sought refuge in suicide, killing themselves the moment they had no one else to kill. Others enlisted. They were chased out of the army. Among these was the man who had carried the head of the Princess de Lamballe on a pike. One day, when he was boasting of his murders, the soldiers became indignant and put him to death. Others still were tried as Septembrists and sent to the scaffold. The guilty received their punishment even on this earth. Well, there are people nowadays who would like to rehabilitate them. In vain has Lamartine, the founder of the Second Republic, examined in a burst of noble wrath. Has human speech an execration, an anathema, which is equal to the horror these crimes of cannibals inspire in me, as in all civilized men? In vain have the most celebrated historians of democracy, Edgar Quinet and Michelet, expressed in eloquent terms their indignation against these crimes. In vain has M. Leblanc said, every murder is a suicide. In the victim the body alone is killed, but what is killed in the murderer is the soul. There are men who would not alone excuse, but glorify the assassinations and the assassins. End of chapter 35, read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama.
Chapter 36 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Imbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 36. Madame Roland during the massacres. Madame Roland's hatred was appeased. The ambitious bourgeois throned it for the second time at the Ministry. The ambitious bourgeois throned it for the second time at the Ministry of the Interior, and the Queen groaned in captivity in the Temple Tower. The Egeria of the Girondins had not felt her heart swell with a single movement of pity for Marie Antoinette. The fatal 10th of August had seemed to her a personal triumph in which her pride delighted. The parvenue enjoyed the humiliations of the daughter of the German Caesars. Her jealous instincts feasted on the afflictions of the Queen of France and Navarre. Lamartine, indignant at this cruelty on Madame Roland's part, had repented of the eulogies he gave her in his Histoire des Girondins. In his Cours de Littérature, volume 13, Conversation 23, he says, I glided over that medley of intrigue and pomposity which composed the genius, both feminine and Roman,
of this woman. In so doing, I conceded more to popularity than to truth. I wanted to give a Cornelia to the Republic. As a matter of fact, I do not know what Cornelia was, that mother of the Gracchi, who brought up conspirators against the Roman Senate and trained them to sedition, that virtue of ambitious commoners. As to Madame Roland, who inflated a vulgar husband by the breath of her feminine anger against a court she found odious because it did not open to her upstart vanity, there was nothing really fine in her except her death. Her role has been a mere parade of true greatness of soul. What Lamartine finds fault with most of all is her hostility to the martyr queen. He adds, she inspired the Girondins, her intimate friends, with an implacable hatred against the queen, already so humiliated and so menaced. She had neither respect nor pity for this victim. She points her out to the rebellious multitude. She is no longer a wife, a mother, or a French woman. She poses as Nemesis at the door of the temple when the queen is groaning there over her husband, her children, and herself, between the throne and the scaffold. This ostentatious stoicism of implacability is what, in my view, kills the woman with this female demagogue. Alas, if Madame Roland was guilty, she was to be punished cruelly. The colleague of the virtuous Roland was the organizer of the September Massacres. The Republican sheepfold dreamed of by the admirer of Jean-Jacques Rousseau was invaded by ferocious beasts. Human nature had never appeared under a more execrable aspect than since its so-called regeneration, with a naive astonishment. After having sown the wind, she was utterly surprised to reap the whirlwind. What, she said to herself, my husband is minister, or so to speak with great exactness, I am the minister myself, and yet there are people in France who are dissatisfied. Ungrateful nation, why dost thou not appreciate thy happiness? Madame Roland resembled certain politicians who, having attained to power, would willingly disembarrass themselves of those by whose aid they reached it. For the second time, she had just arrived at the goal of her ambition. Who dared, then, to pollute her joy? Why did that Marplot Danton come with his untimely massacres to destroy such brilliant projects and banish such delightful dreams? The man who, as if in derision and antithesis, allowed himself to be called the Minister of Justice, produced the effect of a monster on Madame Roland. The Republic as conceived by him had not the head of a goddess but of a Gorgon. Its eyes glittered with sinister luster. The sword it held was that of an assassin or a headsman. Madame Roland was greatly astonished when, on Sunday, September 2nd, 1792, toward 5 in the evening, when the massacres had already begun, she saw 200 men of forbidding appearance arrive at the Ministry of the Interior and ask for her husband, who was absent. Lucky for him he was, for albeit a minister, they had come to arrest him in virtue of a mandate of the Communal Council of Surveillance. Not finding Roland, the 200 men retired. One of them, with his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a sabre in his hand, declaimed furiously against the treachery of ministers. A few minutes later, Danton said to Pétion, "Do you know what they have taken into their heads? If they haven't, issue a decree to arrest Roland." "Who did that?" demanded the mayor. Those devils of committeemen. I have taken the mandate. Hold, here it is." What was Madame Roland doing the next day, when the worst of the massacres were going on? She gave a dinner, and allowed the Prussian anarchist Clootz, who came, moreover, uninvited, to make a regular defense of these horrible murders. The events of the day, she says in her memoirs, formed the subject of conversation. Clootz pretended to prove that it was an indispensable and salutary measure. He uttered a good many commonplaces about the people's rights, the justice of their vengeance, and of its utility to the welfare of the species. He talked a long while and very loudly, ate still more, and fatigued more than one listener. And yet, revolutionary passions had not extinguished every notion of humanity and justice in Madame Roland's soul. On that very day, she induced her husband to write a letter to the National Assembly concerning the massacres. But how weak and undecided is this letter, and how public opinion must have been lowered and debased when it could regard Roland as a courageous minister. In place of scathing the murderers with the energy of an honest man, he pleads extenuating circumstances in their favor. "It is in the nature of things and according to the human heart," he said in his pale missive, "that victory should lead to some excesses. The sea, agitated by a violent storm, continues to roar long after the tempest, but everything has its limits and must finally see them determined. Yesterday was the day over whose events we ought perhaps to draw a veil. I know that the terrible vengeance of the people carries with it a sort of justice, but how easy it is for scoundrels and traitors to abuse this effervescence, and how necessary it is to arrest it. This language produced not the least effect. The massacres went on, and Roland remained minister, although in his letter of September 3rd he had written, "I ask the privilege of resigning if the silence of the laws does not permit me to act." The virtuous Roland sat in the council beside his colleague, the organizer of this human butchery. September 13th he addressed a letter to the Parisians in which he burnt incense to himself, bragged about his character, his actions and his firmness, and carried his infatuation so far as to write, "I have twice accepted a burden which I felt myself able to bear." Ah, how difficult it is to renounce even a shadow of power, and of what compromises with their consciences are not ministers capable in order to retain for a few days longer the portfolios that are slipping from their hands. In the depths of his soul, Roland, like his wife, had the profoundest horror of the murders and the murderers. And yet notice how he extenuates them in his letter to the Parisians. "I admired August 10th. I trembled over the results of September 2nd. I carefully considered what the betrayed patience of the people and their justice had produced, and I did not blame a first impulse too inconsiderately. I believe that its further progress should have been prevented, and that those who were seeking to perpetuate it were deceived by their imagination or by cruel and evil-minded men. If the erring brethren recognize that they have been deceived, let them come. My arms are open to them." That was a very prompt amnesty. Already the assassins are but erring brethren, and the minister welcomes them into his arms. The Gironde kept silence, or if it spoke, it was to attribute, like Vergniaud, the massacres to the émigré and the satellite of Coblentz. Later on they were horrified by the crimes, but it was when others were to profit by them. Each taken by himself, the Girondins did not hesitate to condemn the murders, but taken as a whole they considered merely the interests of their party. Were not 3 of them still in the ministerial council? What had they to complain of then? The September massacres are the most striking expression of what abominations the ambitious may commit or allow to be committed in order to maintain themselves a few weeks longer in power. But there is a voice in the depths of conscience which neither interest nor ambition can succeed in stifling. Madame Roland could not blind herself. The odious reality appeared to her. At last she saw the yawning gulf beneath her feet, and she uttered a cry of terror. A secret voice warned her that her fate would be like that of the September victims. After the 9th of that fatal month, her imagination was vividly impressed. Bloody phantoms rose before her. She wrote on that day to Bancal des Issards, "If you knew the frightful details of these expeditions. You know my enthusiasm for the revolution. Well, I am ashamed of it. It has become hideous. In a week, how do I know what may happen? It is degrading to remain in office, and we are not permitted to leave Paris. We are detained so that we may be destroyed at the propitious moment." From that time a rising anger and indignation took possession of the mind and heart of the Egeria of the Girondins, and constantly increased until the hour when she ascended the steps of the scaffold. She writes in her memoirs apropos of the September massacres, "All Paris witnessed these horrible scenes executed by a small number of wretches. There were but 15 at the Abbey, at the door of which only 2 National Guards were stationed, in spite of the applications made to the Commune and the Commandant. All Paris permitted it to go on. All Paris was accursed in my eyes, and I no longer hoped that liberty might be established among cowards, insensible to the worst outrages that could be perpetrated against nature and humanity, cold spectators of attempts which the courage of 50 armed men could have prevented with ease. It is not the first night that astonishes me, but 4 days, an inquisitive people going to see the spectacle. No, I know nothing in the annals of the most barbarous peoples which can compare with these atrocities. What a striking lesson for those who play with anarchical passions, and end by falling themselves into the snares they have laid for others. Nothing is more deserving of study than this retaliatory punishment which is found, one may say, on every page of revolutionary histories. The hour was coming when the Girondins and their heroine would repent of the means they had employed to overset the throne. This was when the same means were employed against them, when they recognized their own weapons in the wounds they received. Then, when they had no more interest in keeping silence, they sought to escape a complicity that gained them nothing. Instead of the luminous heights which in their golden dreams they had aspired to gain, they fell. crushed and overwhelmed into a dismal gulf, full of tears and blood. How bitter then were their recriminations against men and things! It was only to virtue that the dying Brutus said, "Thou art but a name." The Girondins said it also to glory, to country, and to liberty. Those among them who did not succeed in fleeing disavowed, denounced, and insulted each other before the revolutionary tribunal. At the Conciergerie they intoned the Marseillaise, but parodying the demagogic chant in this wise: "Contre nous, de la tyrannie, le couteau sanglant élevé." Read the memoirs of Louis, Bugeaud, Barbaroux, Pétion, and Madame Roland, and you will see to what extremes of bitterness the language of deceived ambition can go. They are paroxysms of rage, howls of anger, shrieks of despair. Consider the difference between philosophy and religion. The philosopher's curse and the Christian pardons. Yes, as Edgar Quinet has said, Louis XVI alone speaks of forgiveness on that scaffold to which the others were to bring thoughts of vengeance and despair, and by that he seems still to reign over those who were to follow him in death with the passions and the furies of earth. Louis XVI will be magnanimous and calm. A celestial sweetness will overspread this royal countenance. An infernal rage will distort the heart and the features of the Girondins. What pains, what tortures in their death struggle! Earth fails them, and they do not look to heaven. What accents of disgust and hatred when they speak of their former accomplices now become their executioners. Great God, Bugeaud will say, if it is only by such men and such infamous means that republics can arise and be consolidated, there is no government more frightful on this earth, nor more fatal to human happiness. He will address these insults, worthy of the imprecations of Camillus, to the city of Paris. I say truly that France can expect neither liberty nor happiness except from the irreparable destruction of that capital. Barbaroux will be more severe. His anathemas are launched not only at Paris, but at all France. The people, he says, do not deserve that one should become attached to them, for they are essentially ungrateful. It is the absurdest folly to try to conduct to liberty people without morals, who blaspheme God and adore Marat. These people are no more fit for a philosophical government than the Lazzaroni of Naples or the cannibals of America. Liberty, virtue, sacred rights of men, today you are nothing but empty names. Pétion, before dying, will write to his son this letter, which is like the testament of the Gironde. My greatest torment will be to think that so many crimes went unpunished. Vengeance is here the most sacred of duties. My son, either the murderers of thy father and thy country will be delivered to the severities of the law and expiate their crimes upon the scaffold, or thou art under obligation to free thy country from them. They have broken all the ties of society. Their crimes are of such a nature that they do not fall under ordinary rules. From such monsters every one is authorized to purge the earth. Madame Roland will not be less vehement than Bugeaud, Barbaroux, and Pétion. She will address these severe but just reproaches to her friends who had not been valiant enough in their own defense. They temporized with crime, the cowards. They were to fall in their turn, but they succumbed shamefully, pitied by nobody, and with nothing to expect from posterity but utter contempt. Rather than obey their tyrants, than descend from the bar and go out of the assembly like a timid flock about to be branded by the butcher, why did they not do justice to themselves by falling on the monsters to annihilate them, rather than be sentenced by them? It is not her friends alone whom her anger will lash, but the sovereign people, the people once so flattered, whom she will pursue with her anathemas. The people, she will say, can feel nothing but the cannibal joy of seeing blood flow, in order that they may run no risk of shedding their own. That predicted time has come when, if they ask for bread, dead bodies will be given them. But their degraded nature takes pleasure in the spectacle, and the satisfied instinct of cruelty makes the dearth supportable until it becomes absolute. The Egeria of the Girondins will comprehend that all is lost, that even her blood will be sterile, and that France is condemned either to anarchy or a dictatorship. Liberty, she will exclaim, was not made for this corrupt nation, which leaves the bed of debauchery or the dunghill of poverty only to brutalize itself in license, and howl as it wallows in the blood streaming from scaffolds. Like the damned souls in Dante, Madame Roland will leave all hope behind, and when, a few days after Marie Antoinette, she ascends the steps of the guillotine, instead of thinking of heaven like the Queen, she will address this sarcastic speech to the plaster statue which has replaced that of Louis XV. O liberty, how they have betrayed thee! But let us not anticipate. The Girondins are still to have a glimmer of joy. The Republic is about to be proclaimed. End of chapter 36. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto, Birmingham, Alabama. Chapter 37 of Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Marie Antoinette and the Downfall of Royalty by Humbert de Saint-Amand. Translated by Elizabeth G. Martin. Chapter 37. The Proclamation of the Republic. One of the astonishing things in the French Revolution, says one of the most eminent writers of the democratic school, Edgar Quinet, is the unexpectedness with which the great changes occur. The most important events, the destruction of the monarchy and the advent of the Republic, came about without any previous warning. The most ardent Republicans were Royalists, not merely under the old regime, but after 1789, and even up to August 10, 1792. Marat wrote in number 374 of the Ami du Peuple, February 17, 1791, I have often been represented as a mortal enemy of royalty, but I claim that the king has no better friend than myself. And he added, as to Louis XVI personally, I know very well that his defects are chargeable solely to his education, and that by nature he is an excellent sort of man, whom one would have cited as a worthy citizen if he had not had the misfortune to be born on the throne. But, such as he is at all events the king we want. We ought to thank heaven for having given him to us. We ought to pray that he may be spared to us. Marat praying, Marat thanking heaven, and for whom? For the king. Does not that prove what deep root royalty had taken in France? April 20th, 1792, the same Marat bitterly reproached Condorcet with shamelessly calumniating the Jacobin Club and perfidiously accusing it of wishing to destroy the monarchy. L'Ami du Peuple, number 434. June 13, he attacked those who violated the oath taken at the time of the Federation and said, to defend the Constitution is the same thing as to be faithful to the nation, the law, and the king. L'Ami du Peuple, number 448. During the entire continuance of the Legislative Assembly, when Robespierre, having left the tribune, was pretending to educate the people by means of his journal, what he defended to the utmost was a royal constitution. Madame Roland relates that after the flight to Varennes, when the prospect of a republic loomed up, possibly for the first time, at a secret meeting, Robespierre, grinning as usual and biting his nails, asked ironically what a republic might be. In June 1792, the entire Jacobin Club was royalist still. It proposed to drop Biot-Varennes because Biot-Varennes had dared to put the monarchical principle in question. On the 7th of July following, 2 months and a half, that is, before the opening of the Convention, at the time of the famous Lamourette Kiss, all the members of the Assembly swore to execrate the Republic forever. 3 weeks after September 2nd, Danton alleged the paucity and the weakness of the Republicans compared with the Royalists as motives for the massacres. Pétion has said, when the insurrection of August 10th was undertaken, there were but 5 men in France who desired a republic. Buzot, Madame Roland's idol, had written, a wretched mob, unintelligent and unenlightened, vomited forth insults against royalty. The rest neither desired nor willed anything but the Constitution of 1791, and spoke of the Republicans just as one speaks of extremely honest fools. This people is Republican only through force of the guillotine, and yet September 21st, 1792, the Convention, holding its first sitting in the hall of the Manège, began by proclaiming the Republic. Buzot, in his memoirs, has thus described the deputations that were sent to the bar and the people that occupied the galleries. It seemed as if the outlet of every sewer in Paris and other great cities had been searched for whatever was most filthy, hideous, and infected. Villainously dirty faces, surmounted by shocks of greasy hair, and with eyes half sunk into their heads, they spat out, with their nauseating breath, the grossest insults mingled with the sharp snarls of carnivorous beasts. The galleries were worthy of such legislators, men whose frightful aspect betokened crime and poverty, and women whose shameless faces expressed the filthiest debauchery. With all these, with hands and feet and voice, made their horrible racket, one seemed to be an assembly of devils. When the session opened, Collot d'Herbois was the first speaker. He said, "There is a matter which you cannot put off until tomorrow, which you cannot put off until this evening, which you cannot defer for a single instant without being unfaithful to the wishes of the nation. It is the abolition of royalty." Quinet having objected that it would be better to present this question when the constitution was to be discussed, Grégoire, constitutional bishop of Blois, claimed, "Certainly, no one will ever propose to us to preserve the deadly race of kings in France. All the dynasties have been breeds of ravenous beasts, living on nothing but human flesh. Still it is necessary to reassure plainly the friends of liberty. This magic talisman, which has power to stupefy so many men, must be destroyed." Bazire remarked that it would be a frightful example to the people to see an assembly which they had entrusted with their dearest interests resolve upon anything in a moment of enthusiasm and without thorough discussion. Grégoire replied with vehemence, What need is there of discussion when everybody is of the same mind? Kings in the moral order are what monsters are in the physical order. Courts are the workshop of crime and the lair of tyrants. The history of kings is the martyrology of nations. We are all equally penetrated by this truth. What is the use of discussing it? Then the question, put to vote in these terms, "The National Convention declares that royalty is abolished in France," was adopted amidst applause. At 4 in the afternoon of the same day, a municipal officer named Lubin, surrounded by mounted gendarmes and a large crowd of people, came to read a proclamation before the Temple Tower. The trumpets were sounded. A great silence ensued, and Lubin, who had a stentorian voice, read aloud to be heard by the royal family confined in the dungeon this proclamation, the death knell of monarchy. "Royalty is abolished in France. All public acts will be dated from the first year of the Republic. The seal of the state will be inscribed with this motto, République Française. The national seal will represent a woman seated on a sheaf of arms, holding in one hand a pike surmounted by a liberty cap. Hébert, the famous Père Duchesne, was at this moment on guard near the royal family. Sitting on the threshold of their chamber, he sought to discover a movement of vexation or anger, or any other emotion on their faces. He was unsuccessful. While listening to the revolutionary decree which snatched away his throne, the descendant of St. Louis, Henry IV, and Louis XIV experienced not the slightest trouble. He had a book in his hand, and he quietly went on reading it. As impassive as her spouse, the Queen neither made a movement nor uttered a word. When the proclamation was finished, the trumpets sounded again. Cléry then went to the window, and the eyes of the crowd turned instantly towards him. As they mistook him for Louis XVI, they overwhelmed him with insults. The gendarmes made threatening gestures, and he was obliged to withdraw so as to quiet the tumult. When the populace was unchained around the Temple prison, one man alone was calm. One man alone seemed a stranger to all anxiety. It was the prisoner. A new era begins. The death struggle of royalty is over. Royalty is dead, and the king is soon to die. Grégoire, who had stolen the vote, there were but 371 conventionists present. 374 were absent, that is to say, more than half, is both surprised and enthusiastic about what he has done. He confesses that for several days his excessive joy deprived him of appetite and sleep. Such joy will not last very long. M. Taine compares revolutionary France to a badly nourished workman, poor and overdriven with toil, and yet who drinks strong liquors. At first, in his intoxication, he thinks he is a millionaire, loved and admired. He thinks himself a king. But soon the radiant visions give place to the black and monstrous phantoms. At present, France has passed through the period of joyous delirium, and is about to enter on another that is sombre. Behold it, capable of daring, suffering, and doing all things whenever its guides, as widely astray as itself, shall point out an enemy or an obstacle to its fury. How quickly the disenchantments come! Already Lafayette, the man of general illusions, has had to imitate the conduct of those émigrés on whom he has been so severe. He has fled to a foreign land, and found there not a refuge but a prison. He will remain more than 5 years in the gloomy fortress of Olmutz. The victor of Valmy, Dumouriez, will hardly be more fortunate. He will go over to the enemy and live in exile on a pension from foreign powers. How close together deceptions and recantations come! Marat, who has already said to the inhabitants of the capital, "Eternal cockneys, with what epithets would I not assail you in the transports of my despair, if I knew any more humiliating than that of Parisians? Marat, who has said to all Frenchmen, "No, no, liberty is not made for an ignorant, light and frivolous nation, for cits, brought up in fear, dissimulation, knavery and lying, nourished in cunning, intrigue, sycophancy, avarice and swindling, subsisting only by theft and rapine, aspiring after nothing but pleasures, titles and decorations, and already ready to sell themselves for gold." Marat will write May 7th, 1793, that is to say, to establish and consolidate liberty have been thoughtless, vain and illusory, even supposing them to have been taken in good faith. The greater part seems to have had for their object to perpetuate oppression, bring on anarchy, death, poverty and famine, to make the people weary of their independence, to make liberty a burden, to cause them to detest the revolution through its excessive disorders, to exhaust them by watching, fatigue, want and inanition, to reduce them to despair by hunger, and to bring them back to despotism by civil war. There were 6 ministers appointed on August 10th. 2 of them, Clavier and Roland, will kill themselves. 2 others, Lebrun Tondu and Danton, will be guillotined. The remaining 2, Chevin and Monge, are destined to become, one a general of division under Napoleon, and the other a senator of the Empire and Count of Pelleuse. And when, at the beginning of his reign, the Emperor complains to the latter because there are still partisans of the Republic to be found, "Sire," the former minister of August 10th will answer, "we had so much trouble to make them Republicans. May it please your Majesty kindly to allow them at least a few days to become Imperialists." Of the 2 men who had so enthusiastically brought about the proclamation of the Republic, one, Collot d'Herbois, will be transported to Guyana by the Republicans and die there in a paroxysm of burning fever. The other, Gregoire, will be a senator of the Empire, which will not, however, preventing him from promoting the despotism of Napoleon, as he had promoted that of Louis XVI. There are men who will exchange the jacket of the sans-culotte for the gilded livery of an imperial functionary. The conventionists and regicides are transformed into dukes and counts and barons. David, the official painter of the Empire, Napoleon's favorite, will paint with joy the picture of a pope, and be very proud of his great picture of the new Charlemagne's coronation. But listen to Edgar Quinet. "When I see the orators of deputations taking things with such a high hand at the bar, and lauding it so proudly over mute and complacent assemblies, I should like to know what became of them a few years later." And thereupon he sets out to discover their traces. But after considerable investigation he stops. "If I searched any further," he exclaims, "I should be afraid of encountering them among the petty employees of the Empire. It was quite enough to see Huguenot, the indomitable president of the insurrectionary commune, so quickly tamed, soliciting and obtaining a post as clerk of town gates as soon as absolute power made its reappearance after the 18 Brumaire. The terrible Santerre becomes the gentlest of men as soon as he is pensioned by the first consul. Hardly had Boudon de Louage and Albite, these men of iron, felt the rod, then you see them the supplest functionaries of the Empire. The great king-taker Drouet thrones in it the sub-prefecture of Saint-Menehould. Napoleon had related that, on August 10th, he was in a shop in the Carrousel, whence he witnessed the taking of the palace. If he had a presentiment then, he must have smiled at the chaos which he was to reduce so easily to its former limits. How many furies, and all to terminate so soon in the accustomed obedience! Is not history, with its perpetual alternatives of license and despotism, like a virtual circle? And do not the nations pass their time in producing webs of Penelope, whose blood threads they weave and unweave again with tears? All governments, royalties, empires, republics ought to be more modest, but all, profoundly forgetful of the lessons of the past, believe themselves immortal. All declare haughtily that they have closed forever the era of revolutions. With the advent of the Republic, a new calendar has been put in force. The equality of days and nights at the autumnal equinox opened the era of civil equality on September 22nd. Who would have believed that this human geometry, so profoundly calculated, was written in the sand, and that in a few years no traces of it would remain? The heavens have continued to gravitate, and have brought back the equality of days and nights, but they have allowed the promised liberty and equality to perish, like meteors that vanish in empty space. The sans-culottes have not been able to make themselves popular among the starry peoples. An ancient belief which the men of the Revolution had neglected through fear or through contempt was again met with. a spectre had appeared. A chilly breath like that of Samuel had made itself felt, and lo, the edifice so sagely constructed and leaning on the worlds had vanished away. There lies at the foundation of history a supreme sadness and melancholy. This never-ending series of illusions and deceptions, errors and afflictions, faults and crimes, this rage and passion and folly, so many efforts and fatigues, so many dangers, tortures and tears, so much blood, such revolutions, catastrophes, cataclysms of every sort, and all for what? Wretched humanity, rolling its stone of Sisyphus from age to age, inspires far more compassion than contempt. The painful reflections caused by the annals of all peoples are perhaps more sombre for the French Revolution than for any other period. Edgar Quinet justly laments over the inequality between the sacrifices of the victims and the results obtained by posterity. He affirms that in other histories one thing reconciles us to the fury of men,